340,000 people are trapped in the game and can't get out. Someone is sobbing on the pavement. Someone is screaming at the sky, demanding that everything be restored to the way it was. And Ethan Call looks at his hands, dirt caked under his fingernails, and makes a decision. He won't deal any damage. He'll be the one the beams break on. A minute ago, everything was different. He was munching on virtual bread in the Lowhaven Tavern and was thinking about deleting his character. And then the ceiling cracked like a bone. A beam broke free from its mount and plummeted straight down toward his head. His body reacted before his brain could. His hands raised his shield. The blow went through his shoulder, into his spine, and down to his knees. And this blow was real. Not a red flash on the screen, not damage numbers in the corner. Heavy, dull. Nails from the beam scraped against the shield's metal, leaving grooves. Ethan inhaled the scent of resin and old wood. He tasted dust on his tongue. He lowered the shield. He stared at his hands. They were real hands, not models. Fingers with dirt under the nails, knuckles with scrapes, veins beneath the skin. He clenched his fist and felt the tendons tense. The engineer's brain kicked in before the gamer's. The beam weighed 12 kilograms. The lever arm was 1 meter 20, 3 metric tons of force at the point of contact. The shield held. The innkeeper was yelling something about the guard. 2 players jumped to their feet and stared at the ceiling. The girl in leather armor backed toward the exit, and the interface hung before his eyes as if nothing had happened. Level 12. Class, Defender. Health, 92%. Everything was in place. Everything was just like in the game, but the beam was real, and the pain was real. And that's when Ethan said it quietly, almost to himself. If everything was real now, he wouldn't fight back. He would become a wall. The next 2 hours turned out to be the strangest of his life. He stepped outside and saw chaos. Players were running around frantically. Some was punching the air, trying to bring up the exit menu that was no longer there. A warrior in heavy armor was screaming at the sky, demanding that the developers put everything back the way it was. Ethan walked past them all. Not because he didn't care, because panic doesn't fix anything. He knew that from the factory. When the pressure in the system creeps up, you don't yell at the pressure gauge, you close the valve. He returned to the tavern. He approached the innkeeper and proposed a deal. He hauls barrels, he unloads carts. In exchange, he takes all the broken shields from the backyard. The innkeeper looked at him as if he were crazy, then at the beam on the floor, then at the grooves left by the nails on the shield, and he agreed. By evening, Ethan had hauled 14 barrels of beer, 6 sacks of flour, and 2 crates of salted fish. His back was aching, his hands were throbbing, and in the yard, a pile of 9 broken shields had grown. He sat down next to it and began to sort through them. 3 shields could be salvaged with new straps. 2 were only good for scrap metal, but the metal was good. The large round shield with a crack down the center would hold up if he laid a strip of metal across it. Ethan worked until dark, with his hands, without any crafting skills, without recipes. Just 3 years at a factory where everything was fixed with wire and swearing. By midnight, he had 2 working shields instead of 1. He slung both onto his back and collapsed into sleep right next to the barrels. The sky above Lowhaven was black and full of stars. You don't see stars like that in Pittsburgh. Ethan looked up and counted. 340,000 people lie in capsules somewhere in the real world, and they can't get out. He counted them just as he used to count the bolts on the support beams. Every bolt in its place, every person in their capsule. 340,000. The morning of the second day began with a scream. Someone was calling for help on Main Street. Ethan grabbed both shields and rushed over there. By the fountain, 3 players in black cloaks had surrounded a merchant, an NPC with a cart full of fabrics. Before, NPCs had been mere scenery. Now, the merchant was screaming in fear and covering his head with his hands, and the scream was real. The 3 in cloaks were level 15, thieves. They'd already realized that the world had become real, and they'd decided that since there were no laws, they could take whatever they wanted. One of them swung his sword at the merchant. Ethan stepped between them. His shield took the blow. The sword slid aside. The thief stepped back and stared at him. Level 12 versus level 15, 3 against 1. The odds weren't in Ethan's favor, but that was just damage math, and Ethan had no intention of striking back. He raised a second shield, completely shielding the merchant. The first thief struck from the left. The shield blocked it. The second struck from the right. The second shield blocked it. The third tried to flank him, but Ethan stepped back and pressed his back against the cart. There was no way to get around him now. They attacked him for 3 minutes. He didn't strike back even once. He just stood there. He adjusted his shields at the right angle so the swords would slide off rather than dig in. His HP was slowly dropping. 90, 85, 80. But the thieves ran out of steam first. Their stamina was gone. The swords felt heavy. Their swings grew slow. One spat and said the nutcase wasn't worth the time. They left. The merchant was trembling behind the cart. Ethan lowered his shields and asked if everything was okay. The merchant nodded. He asked how he could repay him. Ethan didn't need the fabric, but under the cart, he noticed a coil of thick leather rope. He asked for it. The merchant handed it over without hesitation. By lunchtime, Ethan was sitting in the courtyard, tying a metal strip to his cracked shield with the rope, roughly but securely. He slammed the shield against the wall. Again, harder. The crack held. Now he had 3 shields, 2 regular ones and 1 reinforced one. He slung all 3 over his back and headed to the market. A quiet panic reigned there. The NPC merchants were working as usual, while players wandered between the stalls with vacant stares. Some were stocking up on food, others were selling weapons at any price. Ethan found a blacksmith who was selling nails. He bought a handful with his last bit of silver. He returned to the courtyard and began hammering. Nail by nail, he reinforced his gauntlets. He layered metal plates over the leather. He bent the edges so the blow would slide off rather than get caught. Each nail added a gram of weight and a bit of protection. He didn't know this from in-game hints. He knew it from 3 years at the factory, where an extra millimeter of steel meant a metric ton of safety margin. By evening, the gauntlets weighed half a kilo more, and he could feel the difference. The third morning in Lowhaven began with an earthquake. Ethan woke up when the barrels next to him bounced and rolled across the courtyard. The ground shook with a faint tremor, as if something enormous were marching down the street. He grabbed his shields and ran out into the square. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. A stone golem, level 25. A creature as tall as a 2-story house made of gray granite boulders. It stood in the middle of Lowhaven's central square, slowly turning its head to survey the city. Each of its steps left cracks in the cobblestones. Every movement of its arm stirred up a wind that made the signs on the houses. For 12th level players, this was a death sentence. The golem could smash any of them against the pavement with a single blow. The square emptied in seconds. Players fled into alleys, into houses, into basements, anywhere, just to get away from this colossus. Ethan turned around too. Not out of fear, out of habit. At the factory, when a ladle passed overhead, you didn't stand beneath it. You moved to a safe zone and waited. But then he heard a scream, a high-pitched one, a child's. From the alley to the right of the square, Ethan turned his head. A merchant's cart was stuck in the narrow alley between 2 houses. A large wooden cart with a canvas canopy. Children were sitting under the canopy. 3 of them. A boy of about 10 and 2 younger girls. The merchant's children. The very same fabric merchant Ethan had saved yesterday. The cart was stuck between the buildings, and the children couldn't get out. The golem took a step toward the alley, then another. He wasn't heading toward the children. He was just walking, but his path led straight through the alley, through the cart, through the children. Ethan did the math. 3 seconds until the golem reached the alley. 5 seconds to get there. 2 options. Run from the square and live, or run toward the alley and most likely die. Ethan ran toward the alley. Not because he was a hero, because at the factory, when a ladle is heading toward people, you don't calculate your own chances. You calculate their chances without you. He made it in time. He stood between the golem and the cart. He braced his shield against the cobblestones, a 30-degree angle. A blow from above and the side means the momentum needs to be redirected into the pavement, not absorbed by himself. That's how sloped armor on tanks works. That's how guardrails on bridges work. That's how the physics Ethan learned, not in a game, but in college, works. The golem raised its arm. A fist the size of a barrel hovered over Ethan's head for a split second. Then it came crashing down. The blow struck the shield. The sound was like a bell being struck with a sledgehammer. Ethan sank to one knee. His legs sank into the cobblestones up to his ankles. His arms went numb. His HP dropped by 8%. But the shield held, and Ethan held his ground. The golem pulled its arm back for a second strike. Ethan already knew the rhythm. The windup lasted a second and a half. The blow followed the same trajectory, from above and slightly to the right. Ethan rotated his shield 2 fingers to the right. The second blow came and slid along the slanted surface. The golem's fist skimmed across the shield and slammed into the pavement next to Ethan. The cobblestones exploded in a fountain of shards, but Ethan remained standing. His HP dropped another 3% from the shards, but the brunt of the blow had been absorbed by the ground. The golem swung for the third time. And that's when Ethan saw it. As it swung, the stone plates on the golem's wrist parted. For a split second, a seam opened between them, a narrow gap about the width of a palm, where one stone didn't cover the other. A stress concentrator. Ethan knew that term by heart. The point where the material was weakest, where a crack begins, where a structure breaks. He didn't wait for the third strike. The moment the golem's arm rose and the seam opened, Ethan jabbed at it with his short sword. He didn't chop, he didn't slash, he simply thrust the blade into the gap between the plates and pressed down, just like driving a wedge into a crack in a beam. The damage was laughable. 7 points. The golem had 20,000 HP, but Ethan wasn't attacking its HP. He was attacking its structure. The stone around the blade began to crack. A web of fine lines spread across the golem's wrist, creeping upward toward its elbow. The golem's arm wavered, its fingers unclenched. The fist crumbled into 3 large pieces that crashed to the ground, raising a cloud of dust. The golem staggered. It fell to one knee. Its other hand reached toward Ethan, but without its fist, the blow was weak and inaccurate. Ethan blocked it with his shield, barely exerting any effort. And just then, the others arrived. The 5 players who had been watching the fight from a safe distance finally made up their minds. The warrior with the 2-handed sword slashed at the golem's knee. The mage hurled a fireball into the crack in its shoulder. The archer drove 3 arrows into its eye socket. They finished off the golem in a minute. When the last piece of stone crumbled onto the cobblestones, the square fell silent. Then someone clapped. Then someone else. Ethan didn't turn around to face the applause. He was looking at the cart. The children were sitting under the awning, their eyes wide with fear, but alive. All 3 of them. The boy was holding his sisters close. Then, from around the corner, that very same cloth merchant. He rushed to the cart, embraced the children, and burst into tears. Then he turned to Ethan. His face was wet. His hands were shaking. He asked how he could repay him. With anything. Ethan looked at his sword. The blade was intact, not a scratch. 7 damage points, and not a scratch. He looked at the merchant and asked him for his old horseshoes. All of them. The merchant didn't understand, but he nodded. By evening, Ethan was sitting in the tavern's backyard with a handful of old, rusty horseshoes and a hammer he'd borrowed from the innkeeper. He straightened out the horseshoes, cut them into strips, riveted them to his bracers. Each strip lay on top of the previous one, layer upon layer, metal upon metal. By nightfall, his bracers weighed a kilogram more, but they withstood the troll's blow. Ethan tested them the next morning when a level 20 troll wandered up to the city walls. The troll's blow was weaker than a golem's. The gauntlets didn't even rattle. Ethan stood at the city gates, taking the blows while 3 archers shot at the troll from a safe distance. It took 4 minutes. The troll fell. Ethan looked at his bracers. Not a single rivet had budged. Not a single strip had come loose. He nodded to himself. His calculations were correct. There was a margin of safety. He could keep going. By the middle of the first week, everyone in Lowhaven knew his name. Not by his nickname, but by his description. The guy with 2 shields who couldn't be pierced. The guy who stands his ground and doesn't fall. The guy who took on a level 25 golem at level 12 and didn't get a single scratch. It was a lie, of course. There were scratches. His HP dropped to 84% at the worst moment. But people don't remember numbers. People remember the image. And the image was simple. A cloud of dust settles. Everyone waits. Out of the dust emerges a guy in crumpled armor with 2 shields on his back. Unharmed. Calm. Alive. Everyone remembered that image. On the 6th day, a girl came to see Ethan. She wasn't very tall. Her dark hair was tied back in a ponytail. She wore a white priestess's robe with a green stripe on the sleeve, the symbol of a healer. She introduced herself as Chung Hyun and said she'd come to examine him after his battle with the golem. Ethan replied that the battle had taken place 5 days ago. Chung nodded and said she'd heard. But she'd been busy. There were many wounded in the city after the glitch, and she'd been treating them one by one. Ethan turned out to be last on the list because, according to rumors, he didn't need treatment. She wanted to check for herself. Ethan removed his bracelet and held out his arm. Chung took his wrist. Her fingers were cold and precise. She closed her eyes and cast a diagnostic spell. A green glow traveled up Ethan's arm from his wrist to his shoulder. Chung opened her eyes. She paused for a moment. Then she said that there really was nothing to treat. HP full, no injuries, status clear. She said it in the same tone a doctor uses when telling a patient their test results are normal, with a hint of surprise and a hint of suspicion. Ethan thanked her and put the bracelet back on. Chung didn't leave. She stood there, looking at his armor, at the rivets made of nails, the strips of horseshoes, and the leather straps used to fasten everything that could be fastened. She asked why he needed so many layers. Ethan replied that each layer provided a margin of safety. Chung asked, "A margin of safety against what?" Ethan replied, "From everything." Chung fell silent again. Then she said she'd come by every evening to check on him, just in case. Ethan wanted to say there was no need for that, but he looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the way she was clenching her fingers, at the way she looked at his full HP bar with the expression of someone who had finally found a patient they wouldn't lose. And he said he'd wait. From that day on, Chung Ha-yun came every evening. She'd sit down next to him, run a diagnostic, tell him everything was fine, and she'd leave. On the third evening, Ethan noticed that she'd fallen asleep sitting there, leaning against a barrel just a few steps away from him. He took off his cloak and covered her with it. In the morning, the cloak lay neatly folded on the barrel. Chung was already gone, but there was an extra piece of bread on his plate at the tavern. The second week in Etherfall brought the first deaths, not from monsters, from people. On the southern outskirts of Lockhaven, a group of 7 players attacked a trade caravan. 4 of the caravan's guards were killed, for good. Their bodies shattered into shards of light and vanished. In the real world, 4 people in their capsules stopped breathing. Ethan found out about it that morning when the innkeeper told him over breakfast. He finished his bread, drank the last of his water, went out into the backyard, sat down on the ground next to his shields, and sat there for an hour without moving. 340,000 minus 4. 339,996. He counted them every night. Now the number was smaller. Chong found him there. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. She sat down next to him and remained silent too. 10 minutes later, Ethan stood up. He picked up his shields and walked toward the city gates. If people are killing people, then monsters alone aren't enough. That means he needs to stand not only in front of the golems. That means he needs to stand among the people. At the gates, he ran into Avery. She was standing on the fortress and was looking down the road through the sight of her bow. Tall, her red hair was tied back with a rag. The archer's leather armor had empty sockets for enchantments. The quiver on her hip was half empty. Ethan climbed up onto the wall. Avery didn't even turn around. She said the caravan had been attacked that morning, 2 kilometers from the gates. She said she could have taken out 2 of the attackers if she'd been standing a little further along the wall, but she was standing right here, and she didn't see them. Ethan looked at her. She was gripping her bow so tightly her knuckles had turned white, not out of fear, out of anger at herself. He knew that feeling. Every safety engineer knows it. An accident you could have prevented if you'd stood a meter to the left. The bolt you checked yesterday but didn't check today. And today, it snapped. Ethan asked her name. She answered, Avery Dash, 21 years old, archer, Colorado. Been shooting since she was 12. She came into the game looking for a real challenge. She got more than she bargained for. Ethan nodded and said he needed an archer. Avery finally turned to face him. She sized him up. 2 shields on his back, horseshoe-shaped bracers, armor wrapped in leather cords, level 12. She asked why an archer needed a tank that couldn't deal damage. Ethan replied that a wall without a catapult is just a wall, and a catapult without a wall is just a pile of firewood. Avery stared at him for 3 seconds. Then she snorted. Then she said it was the dumbest metaphor she'd ever heard. Then she said, fine. And their first mission together took place that very same day. The southern road from Lohaven, the spot where a caravan had been attacked that morning. Ethan walked ahead. Avery walked 20 paces behind him. The distance was his idea. 20 paces is enough time for one aimed shot if he's attacked from the front, and enough time to turn around if attacked from behind. They'd walked 2 kilometers before the wolves appeared. 5 of them, level 16. For a lone level 12, that's serious. For 2, it's manageable. Ethan stopped. He raised his shield. The wolves lunged at him. The first one leaped. Ethan took the blow with his shield and knocked the beast aside. The second and third attacked simultaneously from different sides. Ethan spun around, crossing his shields. 2 blows, 2 screeches of claws against metal. 3% HP. Behind him, the bowstring sang. Avery's arrow pierced the first wolf's eye. 1 hit, 1 kill. The wolf crumbled. The second arrow found the second wolf's throat. The third pierced the third wolf's side. 4 seconds, 3 wolves. Ethan hadn't even had time to turn around. The remaining 2 wolves froze. They looked at their dead companions, then at Ethan. Then they turned and fled into the forest. Avery lowered her bow. She walked over to Ethan. She looked at his shield. 3 claw scratches. She said he was slow. Ethan agreed. He said that was exactly why he needed her. Avery snorted again, but differently this time. On the way back, they picked up the remains of the caravan. 2 overturned vans, scattered cargo. The guards' bodies were already gone, but blood remained on the road. Real blood. Dark. Thick. Ethan stopped next to her. He looked. Then he began gathering the scattered goods back into the van. Avery joined him in silence. They brought the van into town by evening. The merchants at the market took the goods. No one asked where they came from. Everyone knew anyway. The next day, Ethan and Avery set out again. And on the next, and the next. Every day they patrolled the road from the gate to the intersection 5 kilometers away. Ethan in front, Avery behind. The wall and the catapult. In 4 days, they killed 12 wolves, 8 wild boars, 1 troll. And they scared off 2 groups of looting players who, at the sight of Ethan and his shields, decided the loot wasn't worth the effort. Experience points came slowly. By the end of the 2nd week, Ethan had reached level 13. Avery was at level 14. The level difference didn't bother him. Something else did. He sat in the tavern's backyard that evening, scribbling on a piece of parchment. Numbers, columns, formulas. A wolf's HP, Avery's DPS, kill time, his own defense, HP loss per battle, regeneration between battles, arrow consumption. He calculated his survival budget the same way a factory calculated the structural integrity of its designs, and the numbers told him one simple thing. The 2 of them weren't enough. A wall and a catapult, but a single catapult was too slow. He needed a second one. He needed a third. He needed someone to finish off enemies quickly while he held the line. He needed someone to heal him if he did end up going down. He needed a team. Chong arrived in the evening, as usual. She sat down next to him. She ran a diagnostic. She said everything was fine. Ethan showed her the parchment with the calculations. He asked if she would go with them. Chong stared at the numbers for a long time. Then she asked why he needed a healer if he was impossible to kill. Ethan replied that he could be killed. It's just difficult. But sooner or later, something will come along that can break through, and at that moment, he'll need someone to heal the wound. Chong looked at him, at his calm face, at his hands, which were carefully writing the numbers on the parchment, at his full HP. She said yes. So there were 3 of them now, the wall, the catapult, and the foundation beneath the wall. Their first joint outing as a trio took place the next morning, the Southern Road, a familiar route, but this time they went further, 7 kilometers from the city. A territory inhabited not by wolves, but by hornets. Level 18 poisonous insects the size of a dog. The poison reduced HP by 2% per second for 10 seconds. For an ordinary player, this was dangerous. For Ethan, it was simple arithmetic. 20% HP per poisoning. His total HP, taking into account all 17 pieces of armor he was wearing at that moment, was 3,200 units. 20% is 640. He had 2,560 left, enough to withstand 3 more poisonings before it became dangerous. And Chong could neutralize the poison in 4 seconds. Ethan explained this to Avery and Chong before the fight, right there on the road. He pulled out a parchment and showed them the calculations. Avery looked at the parchment, then at Ethan. Then she said he was crazy. Then she said she liked it. The battle with the hornets went according to plan. Ethan stood there. The hornets stung, the venom flowed, Chong healed, Avery shot. 6 hornets in 8 minutes. 0 deaths, 0 casualties, 0 panic. When the last hornet fell, Ethan checked his HP. 71%. Chong restored it to full in 20 seconds. Ethan nodded. The 3rd week in Aetherfall, Ethan sat in the tavern's backyard and counted. Not monsters, not HP. People. In the 2 weeks since the glitch, the number of players on the server had dropped from 340,000 to 328,000. 12,000 people. Dead. Forever. Most from monsters that had become more aggressive and smarter after the glitch. Some from disease and starvation, because in Aetherfall, you now had to actually eat and sleep. Some from other players. Ethan wrote the numbers down on parchment every night. A system announcement appeared once a day at midnight. The number of active players. The number decreased every day, sometimes by 10, sometimes by 100. Once, it dropped by 417 when a guild tried to storm a level 30 dungeon with its entire party and never returned. 417 in a single day. Ethan wrote down the number and stared at the parchment for a long time. Then he put it away and went to sleep. In the morning, So Min-soo came to see him. He hadn't seen her approach. He'd simply looked up from the bracers he was repairing after yesterday's battle, and she was already standing right next to him. She was short. Her black hair fell to her shoulders. She wore dark leather assassin armor without a single unnecessary detail. 2 daggers were sheathed at her hips. Her face was expressionless. Her eyes were dark and watchful. She said she wanted to join his group. Ethan asked why. Min-soo paused. Then she said she'd killed a player yesterday, a PK, a marauder who'd been attacking refugees near the Eastern Road. She'd killed him with a single blow, in the back, clean. Professional, just as they'd taught her at the academy, and she felt sick, not because of the killing, but from how easy it had been. She said she kills faster than anyone she knows, and that scares her. Ethan looked at her, at her hands, at the slender fingers resting on the hilt of her daggers in a familiar gesture, at her face, which was calm but not at peace, calm like someone who's used to hiding everything inside. He asked how old she was. She replied, 19. He nodded. Then he said he needed someone who could kill quickly, but not for every fight, just for the ones where there was no other way. The rest of the time, she could just be by his side. Min-soo looked at him for 3 seconds. 4, 5, then she nodded. So there were 4 of them now. That same day, they entered the dungeon for the first time, the Catacombs of Lowhaven, a level 15 dungeon, 3 floors, undead, skeletons, ghosts, poisonous spiders. The boss on the top floor, a level 16 lich with an area of effect attack that reduced the HP of everyone within a 10-meter radius. A standard dungeon. For a party of 5 level 15 players, it was an hour and a half's work. For a party of 4, one of whom was level 13 and one of whom was a damage-dealing tank, it was a challenge. Ethan went in first. He always went in first. It wasn't bravado, it was logic. If there was a trap behind the door, it would strike whoever could withstand it. First floor, a gray stone corridor, torches on the walls, the smell of dampness and rot. 20 paces in, skeletons, 5 of them, level 14. They stirred when the torchlight fell on Ethan's shield. They rose from the corners, raised their rusty swords. Ethan raised his shield. They struck. 1, 2, 3 blows to the shield. His HP didn't budge. The damage dealt by level 14 skeletons to a tank wearing 17 layers of armor was about 0.5%. Nothing. An arrow whistled past Ethan's back, then another. Then a shadow flashed, and 2 skeletons crumbled simultaneously. Min-soo stood between them, daggers in hand. The movement was so fast that Ethan didn't have time to see it. 2 strikes, 2 kills, less than a second. He looked at her. She stood motionless. The daggers were already sheathed. Her face was calm, as if nothing had happened. Ethan nodded and moved on. The second floor was more difficult. Spiders. Poisonous. Fast. They were pouring down from the ceiling in groups of 3 or 4. The venom was weaker than that of hornets, but there were more spiders. Ethan counted as he moved. 1 spider, 1 bite. Minus 1% HP per second for 5 seconds. 2 spiders at once. Minus 2%. 3 spiders. Minus 3. Manageable. Chong was neutralizing the venom. Avery was firing. Min-soo was cutting down those who tried to slip past Ethan. The system was working. The wall held. The catapults were firing. The foundation was holding. They reached the boss 40 minutes later. The lich stood in the center of a circular hall on a stone pedestal. Tall, bony, in a tattered robe, a skull instead of a face, green fire in his eye sockets. Level 16. Area of effect attack every 30 seconds. Ethan stopped the group at the entrance. He pulled out a parchment. He began to draw. Chong stood behind his shoulder and watched. Avery leaned against the wall, twirling an arrow between her fingers. Min-soo sat in the shadows by the entrance and waited. Ethan was calculating. The lich's HP, about 8,000 by his estimate. Avery's DPS, about 120 per second. Min-soo's DPS, about 200, but only in melee and only if the lich isn't moving. The lich's area of effect attack. About 300 damage to everyone within the radius. His own HP, 3,400, taking into account the new shoulder pads he attached yesterday. Chong's heal, about 100 HP per second. Ethan sketched out a plan. He stands in front of the lich. He takes the area of effect attack head on. Chong stands 12 meters away from the lich, outside the radius. He heals Ethan. Avery stands 15 meters away. He shoots. Minsu circles around from behind. He waits. When the Lich turns its back to Ethan to cast the area of effect attack, Minsu strikes it in the back of the head. Maximum damage to an unguarded spot. He showed the plan to the team. Avery said it was crazy. Then she looked at the numbers again and said it was crazy, but it would work. Minsu didn't say anything. She just nodded. Chong asked what would happen if the area of effect attack dealt more than 300 damage. Ethan replied that in that case, he'd just stand there and take it while she healed him, because that's his job. They entered the hall. Ethan went first, shield held out in front of him. The Lich turned toward him. The green fire in its eye sockets flared brighter. Its arms rose. A wave of dark energy swept through the hall. An area of effect attack. Ethan blocked it with a shield. 280 damage. Less than he'd expected. He smiled, for the first time in 2 weeks. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Ethan stood before the Lich, taking the hits. An area of effect attack every 30 seconds. Regular strikes with a bone staff every 2 seconds. HP fluctuated between 70 and 100%. Chong healed steadily and methodically. Not a single wasted spell, not a single missed opportunity. Avery fired arrow after arrow. Every one hit its mark. The Lich's HP was melting away. 8,000. 6. 4. 2. At 1,000 HP, the Lich turned to unleash an area of effect attack toward Avery. Ethan stepped to the side and raised his shield in the path of the attack. The area of effect attack struck the shield. 200 points passed through the shield, but the main brunt was absorbed by the metal. Avery, behind him, didn't take a single point of damage. At that moment, Minsu appeared behind the Lich. 2 daggers pierced the back of its head simultaneously. Critical hit. Multiplier 4. 1,600 points. The Lich crumbled into pieces. The green fire in its eye sockets went out. The bones fell onto the stone floor with a soft thud. Silence. Ethan lowered his shield. He looked at the team. Chong stood with her hands raised, ready to heal. Avery, with her bow drawn, was aiming at the empty space where the Lich had just been. Minsu stood among the bones, daggers in hand. HP for all 4. 100%. 0 casualties. 0 deaths. A level 15 dungeon had been cleared by a party of 4 with 0 casualties. Ethan later learned that this was the first such result on the server since the glitch. Every party that had cleared the dungeon before them had lost at least 1 member, and more often than not, 2. They hadn't lost a single person. When they emerged from the catacombs onto the surface, it was evening. The sun was setting behind the walls of Lowhaven. The air smelled of grass and smoke from the forges. Ethan sat down right at the entrance to the dungeon. He took off his shields. He took off his gauntlets. He stretched his fingers. He looked at his hands. Then at his team. Avery was counting the remaining arrows. Chong was drinking water from a flask. Minsu sat off to the side, sharpening her dagger. Ethan spoke softly. It wasn't a speech, not a pep talk, just a thought spoken aloud. He said he wasn't a tank. He was the foundation. Build on him. Avery looked up from her arrows. She looked at him. She didn't say anything, but she nodded. Chong put away her canteen. Minsu stopped sharpening her dagger for a second. Then she continued, but the corner of her lips twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. News of clearing the catacombs without a single casualty spread throughout Lowhaven within a day, and 2 days later, the entire server knew about it. The system message didn't announce such achievements, just a rumor, just a name. Ethan Call, a level 13 tank with 2 shields, a level 15 dungeon run, 0 deaths. People didn't believe it. Then they checked. Then they believed it. 3 days after the catacombs, there was a line outside the Lowhaven Tavern, not for food, for Ethan. Players wanted to join his party. Tanks wanted to see his build. Leaders of small guilds offered to merge. One merchant brought a set of level 19 armor and offered it as a gift. Ethan turned them all down. He didn't take the armor either. Not out of pride, out of calculation. His system worked because each layer was tailored to the next. Someone else's set meant someone else's tolerances, someone else's angles, someone else's load distribution. Incorporating it into his system would mean rebuilding everything from scratch. But he did take one person. Rebecca Hale came to see him on the 4th day after the catacombs. She didn't join the line. She waited until the line had thinned out. Then she approached when Ethan was sitting alone in the backyard, sketching on parchment. She was older than him, 27, chestnut hair tied in a bun, glasses, which didn't exist in Etherfall, but Rebecca had found some crafter and ordered herself a frame without lenses, just out of habit. A long battle mage's robe with scorched edges from her own spells. She didn't ask to be taken into the group. She looked at his parchment, at the columns of numbers, at the formulas, at the load distribution diagrams. Then she pointed her finger at one of the formulas and said that the dissipation coefficient had been calculated incorrectly. Ethan looked where she was pointing. He looked at the formula, then at her. He asked how she knew what the scattering coefficient was. Rebecca replied that before the glitch, she had taught physics at a high school in Boston for 10 years. Then she sat down next to him and in 20 minutes recalculated 3 formulas on his parchment. The north was incorrect because Ethan hadn't accounted for the angle of impact for different types of strikes. A crushing strike scatters differently than a chopping strike. A chopping strike differs from a thrusting one. A table of correction coefficients is needed for each type. Ethan watched her as she wrote. Then he said she was right. Rebecca stopped writing. She looked up. She looked at him. He saw it in her eyes. Surprise. Not because she was right. She knew she was right. Surprise that someone had acknowledged it. Simply, without argument, without condescension. He asked if she joined them. Rebecca paused. Then she said her DPS was so-so. For a level 20 battle mage, she was a bit weak. She spent too much time calculating spell trajectories instead of just attacking. Ethan replied that he didn't need high DPS. He needed accuracy. Rebecca looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Then she said, "All right." So there were 5 of them now. 5. That was already a full-fledged party. Ethan held their first group debrief that same evening, in the tavern's backyard. 5 people gathered around a scroll spread out on a barrel. Ethan was sketching. Rebecca was making corrections. Avery was offering comments. Chong was listening. Minsu sat in the shadows and watched. Ethan laid out the plan. Their goal was level 30, the threshold beyond which the serious dungeons began. Raid content, world bosses, a real threat and a real reward. To reach level 30, he needed to level up 14 times. The rest needed to level up between 10 and 16 times. According to his calculations, it would take 2 months if they cleared 1 dungeon a day and patrolled the roads between dungeons. Rebecca said the estimate was optimistic. It didn't account for time spent repairing gear or days when someone would be too tired. Ethan nodded. He added a correction. 2.5 months. Avery said that 2.5 months was a long time. Half the server would die out in that time. Ethan replied that if they rushed into the dungeons before they're ready, they'll be the ones to die. Avery fell silent. She knew he was right. Everyone knew. That evening, something happened that Ethan would remember for a long time. He sat alone after everyone had left, double-checking the calculations. Minsu was the first to leave. Avery was second. Rebecca stayed behind to finish up 1 more formula and then left. Chong was the last to leave. She sat on a barrel next to Ethan and said nothing. Then she stood up. She walked over to him. She ran a diagnostic scan. A green glow. HP full. No damage, as usual. But she didn't leave. She stood there, looking at his hands, at the calluses from the hammer, at the scrapes from the rivets, at the dirt under his fingernails. Then she took a small jar out of her bag. Ointment. Medicinal. Not magical. Ordinary. Made from herbs. She made these herself. She placed the jar next to him on the barrel. She said it was for his hands, not for HP, for his hands. Then she left. Ethan looked at the jar. He opened it. He sniffed it. It smelled like mint and something slightly bitter. He rubbed it on his hands. His skin stung at first, then became softer. He closed the jar and put it in his pocket. In the morning, they set out. The first dungeon after the catacombs. The abandoned mine. Level 17. 4 floors. Goblins. Minotaurs. Fire elementals on the lower level. A boss at the bottom. Ethan went in first, as always. Shield held high. Level 16 goblins lunged at him from the darkness. Small. Fast. Curved knives. Ethan raised his shield and took the first wave. 5 goblins struck at once. Total damage, 20 points. 0.6% of his HP. Ridiculous. Behind him, Avery began shooting. An arrow. An arrow. An arrow. An arrow. 3 goblins fell. Minsu flashed in the darkness to the right. 2 daggers. 2 goblins. The 5th tried to escape. Rebecca's fireball caught up with him in the corridor. Precise. Calculated. Traced a parabolic arc, accounting for the curve of the corridor. Rebecca smiled. For the first time in all the time Ethan had known her. They covered 3 floors in 30 minutes. On the second floor, Ethan used his Minotaur tactic for the first time. The Minotaur was level 20. Huge. Horned. With an axe the size of a door. It swung and struck down from above. Ethan didn't hold his shield straight up. He angled it 30 degrees and took half a step to the left. The axe slid off the angled shield and slammed into the stone floor next to him. The impact was absorbed by the ground. Ethan didn't lose a single HP point. The Minotaur froze for a split second with the axe stuck in the floor. Avery shot him in the unprotected throat. Minsu struck his fear. Rebecca finished him off with an icy spear to the chest. 4 seconds from the first strike to the Minotaur's death. 4 seconds. They reached the boss by midday, a level 22 fire elemental, a pillar of living flame in the center of a circular cave. The temperature in the chamber was so high that the metal on Ethan's shield became hot to the touch. Ethan stopped at the entrance. This was the first enemy he couldn't simply outlast. The fire didn't strike a single point. The fire surrounded him. It flowed around him. It seeped into every crack in his armor. His armor protected him from physical damage, but not from magical damage. He looked at Rebecca. He asked if she could create an ice barrier around him. Rebecca thought for a moment. She said she could, but it would use up all her mana for 20 seconds. 20 seconds without her DPS. Ethan nodded. He pulled out a scroll. He began to calculate. Avery's DPS alone, about 120. The boss's HP, roughly 12,000. Kill time, 100 seconds. Plus Minsu when he joins in, minus 30 seconds. Total, 70 seconds of combat. In 70 seconds, Rebecca will be able to cast 3 ice barriers, each lasting 20 seconds, a 10-second break between barriers. During those 10 seconds, Ethan will lose HP from the fire, about 5% per second, 50% HP in 10 seconds. Chong will have time to heal 20% during that time. Total, minus 30% HP for each break. 3 breaks, a total loss of 90%. It's touch and go, but it's possible. Ethan showed his calculations to the team. Avery said he was crazy. Rebecca said the math added up, but the margin of error was critically small. Chong didn't say anything. She just started preparing her spells. Minsu nodded. They went in. Rebecca cast the first ice barrier on Ethan. A layer of frost covered his armor. The heat receded. Ethan stepped toward the pillar of fire. He stood directly in front of it. He raised his shield. The elemental struck. A wave of flame engulfed Ethan. The ice hissed. It began to melt, but it held. 20 seconds. Avery fired ice arrows. Each one caused a flash of steam on contact. The boss's HP crept downward. 12,000. 11. 10. The barrier burst. Fire crashed down on Ethan. The heat cut through his armor like a knife through butter. His HP plummeted. 95%. 90. 85. Chong began healing him. A green glow enveloped Ethan. His HP froze at 80. It fluctuated. Dropped to 75. Rose to 78. Dropped again. 10 seconds without the barrier. The longest 10 seconds of Ethan's life. He stood in the flame. The shield was red hot. The gauntlets burned his skin. Every second was pain. Real pain, not just numbers on a screen. He gritted his teeth and didn't budge. Rebecca cast a second barrier. The cold struck the red-hot metal. The armor hissed. Steam enveloped Ethan. He stood in a cloud of steam and breathed. HP, 73%. Enough. Second cycle. Arrows. Fire. Ice. Pain. Break. Hill. Third cycle. By this point, the boss's HP was at 2,000. Minsu, who had been making her way along the cave wall all this time, avoiding the fire zone, leaped from above. 2 daggers pierced the top of the pillar of fire. A critical hit on the weak spot that Ethan had calculated 5 seconds before the battle began, where the flame was thinnest, where the elemental structure was most fragile. A stress concentrator. Minsu fell through the elemental like a knife through a candle. The pillar of fire split in 2. The 2 halves crashed to the floor and went out. Silence. The steam slowly dissipated. Ethan stood in the middle of the cave. His armor was smoldering. His shield was covered in soot. His hands were scorched. HP, 31%. Chong was already running toward him. A green glow. 35, 40, 50, 60, 70. His HP was creeping up. Ethan stood there, breathing. Avery walked up to him. She looked at his armor, at the scorched, horseshoe-shaped bracers, at the melted rivets. She said he looked terrible. Ethan looked down at himself, then at her. He said the armor could be repaired. Avery was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly that she wasn't talking about the armor. She was talking about his hands, about the burns on his fingers, about the skin blistering from the heat. Ethan looked at his hands. The burns were real. They really hurt. Chong came over and began treating his hands one by one, methodically, finger by finger. The burns began to heal under a green glow. Minsu stood to the side and watched in silence. Then she came over. She took a roll of clean bandages out of her bag. She handed them to Chong. Chong took them. Their fingers touched for a second. Neither of them noticed, or pretended not to. Rebecca sat down on a rock by the wall. She took off her gloves. Her hands were trembling too, not from pain, from tension. 3 icy barriers in a row. That was her limit. She sat there watching Ethan, watching Chong treat his hands, watching Minsu standing nearby with the bandages, at how Avery had moved over to the wall and was quietly counting the remaining arrows, but kept glancing in his direction every now and then. Rebecca took the parchment out of her pocket, the very one on which she and Ethan had calculated the coefficients. She looked at the formulas. She smiled. She wrote a single line at the bottom. The calculation is correct. We do have a reserve is sufficient. A month had passed since the glitch. Ethan sat on the roof of the Lowhaven Tavern and watched the sunset. The city below was alive. Not like before. Not like a game location. Like a real city. Smoke from the chimneys, the smell of roasted meat from the market, the voices of merchants closing their stalls for the night, children's laughter from the alley, and a quiet, constant fear that hung over it all like a fog. Every midnight, a system message appeared in the sky. Number of active players, 319,412. Yesterday, it was 319,441. 29 people in a day. Ethan wrote the number down on his parchment. He closed his eyes. 29. Each one had a name, family, a capsule somewhere in the real world. Now each of their brains had burned out from the feedback, and the body in the capsule had become just a body. He opened his eyes. Enough counting the dead. It was time to count the living. The team had changed over the past month. Not in terms of its members. There were still 5 of them. The dynamics had changed. Avery had stopped calling his plans madness, and had started asking where she should position herself for the best firing angle. Minso had stopped sitting apart from the group, and had started sit 2 steps away from Ethan. Then 1 step, then right next to him. Chong stopped coming only in the evening, and started coming in the morning too, with breakfast. Rebecca stopped silently correcting his formulas, and started explaining why he'd made a mistake, like a teacher, patiently, with examples, and with that special warmth teachers have when a student finally gets it. Ethan was at level 18. Avery was at level 20. Minsu was at level 19. Chong was at level 21. Rebecca was at level 22. The level gap was growing because Ethan earned the least experience from kills. His damage was so low that the system awarded him mere crumbs, but his HP grew faster than anyone else's. Each new piece of armor added not only defense, but also 0.3% to his maximum health. By the end of the first month, Ethan was wearing 21 items with the armor stat. A main breastplate, a thick leather underarmor, horseshoe gauntlets, greaves, a helmet, a visor he had forged himself from a cauldron lid, a gorget, 2 shoulder guards, 2 shields, a ring with a bronze inlay found in a dungeon, a belt with metal plates, boots with iron toes, a cloak made from the scales of a lizard they killed last week, a plate amulet, elbow guards, a breastplate token, and an enchanted flask on his hip in a metal case. Each of these items was useless on its own. Some provided 1 or 2 points of defense. The token provided 0, but each added 0.3% to HP. 21 items, 6.3% additional health, plus the base defense stats that stacked, plus a hidden impulse absorption parameter that tripled due to the combination of hard and resilient layers. No one on the server had done the math. No one saw the point in lugging around extra weight for the sake of fractional percentages. But Ethan had done the math, and those fractional percentages added up to whole numbers, and those whole numbers became reality. On the morning of the 32nd day, a group of 12 people approached the city gates of Lowhaven, refugees, from the town of Crosswood, which lay 40 kilometers to the north. They were filthy, hungry, wounded. Some could barely walk. They were led by a man in his 30s with a bandaged head and a broken sword in his hand. He said Crosswood was no more. 3 days ago, a horde of gnolls had emerged from the forest, hundreds of them, level 50 and above. The town's garrison held out for 6 hours. Then the walls fell. Of the 300 residents, only 12 made it out. Ethan stood by the gate and listened. Then he turned to Chong and said, "Heal them." He turned to Avery and said, "Find them some food." He turned to Rebecca and said, "Find them a place to stay for the night." He turned to Minsu and said nothing. He simply nodded toward the road from which the refugees had come. Minsu disappeared. An hour later, she returned and reported, the gnolls hadn't pursued the refugees. They had ravaged Crosswood and gone back into the forest. But there were tracks on the road from yet another group. Not gnolls, people, players, following the refugees. Ethan realized it immediately. Looters. Those who prey on the weak in the wake of a disaster. He looked at the road leading north, then at his team, then at the refugees whom Chong was already treating by the fountain in the square.
He said he'd stay at the gate, alone. Avery started to argue. Ethan shook his head. If the looters were following the refugees, they'd come to the city. Someone had to stand guard at the gate. And the rest were needed inside. The refugees were wounded, terrified. They needed food, medical care, and a place to sleep. Ethan couldn't give them any of that, but he could give them a wall between them and whatever was coming after them. Avery fell silent. She looked at him, then at the gate. Then she turned and walked toward the market to get food. Chong didn't even look up from the wounded man she was treating. She already knew he would stay. She had always known. Rebecca brushed against his shoulder as she walked past, briefly, as if by accident, but he felt her fingers tighten for a split second before letting go. Minsu lingered beside him for 3 seconds. Then she pulled a rolled-up piece of leather out of her bag, a strap pad for his chest plate, the very strap that had been creaking for the past 2 days. She'd noticed. Ethan took the pad and nodded. Minsu left. He stood alone at the gate. 2 shields, 21 layers of armor, level 18, and he waited. They arrived 2 hours later, 6 of them, all level 25 and above. 2 warriors with 2-handed swords, a mage in a dark robe, an archer, 2 rogues. They all bore the same emblem, a black crown on a red field. Ethan didn't know what it meant, not yet anyway. He would later learn that the Black Crown was the largest PK guild on the server, that their leader, Cyrus Wenz, was a former esports coach from California who, after the glitch, decided that the New World was his chance, that they had 400 fighters and controlled 3 cities, that they had already killed more than 200 players. But right now, Ethan didn't know any of that. He saw 6 armed men following the trail of 12 wounded players, and that was enough. The first warrior stopped 10 paces from the gate. He looked at Ethan, at the 2 shields, at the homemade armor, at the level 18 hanging overhead, and he smirked. He told Ethan to get out of the way, that they had come for the refugees, that the refugees had items belonging to the Black Crown. Ethan didn't answer. He stood there. The warrior repeated himself. Ethan stood there. The mage raised his hand and began to conjure a fireball. Ethan stood there. The fireball flew. It struck the shield. 200 damage, 4% HP. Ethan stood there. Both warriors charged at him simultaneously. 2 two-handed swords came crashing down on his shields from above. Ethan angled his shields. Both blows slid off. One sword embedded itself in a stone pillar of the gate. The other sank into the ground. The archer fired. The arrow struck his breastplate and bounced off. 0 damage. The armor was too thick for an arrow of that level. 2 bandits tried to flank Ethan, but the gate was narrow, 2.5 meters wide. Ethan stood right in the middle. 2 shields completely blocked the passage. The only way to get around him was over the walls, and the walls of Lowhaven were 5 meters high. They attacked him for 20 minutes, with swords, with magic, arrows, poison. They tried everything they had. Ethan stood his ground. His HP fluctuated. It dropped to 70% when the mage cast particularly powerful spells. It rose to 80% during the pauses between attacks thanks to passive regeneration. He didn't strike a single blow. He just stood there. After 20 minutes, the mage was spent. His mana was gone. The archer had shot all his arrows. The warriors were breathing heavily. The bandit stood to the side and looked at Ethan as if he were a wall, literally, because he was a wall. The first warrior spat on the ground. He said this lunatic wasn't worth their time. He said they'd be back, with reinforcements, with siege weapons, with Cyrus himself. Ethan didn't say a word. The 6 turned and walked back north along the road. Ethan stood in the gate until they disappeared over the horizon. Then he lowered his shields. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from tension. 20 minutes with his shields up is tough, even for an 18th level character. He turned and walked toward the fountain. Chong was waiting for him there. She looked at him with that gaze he'd already learned to read, calm on the outside, tense on the inside. She ran a diagnostic. HP, 74%, a few scratches on the left arm guard, a dent in the chest plate, a fireball burn on the right shoulder. She began treating him, silently.
Ethan sat by the fountain and watched the refugees. 12 people, alive, fed. Some were already sleeping on blankets spread out right in the square. A girl of about 8 sat next to a man with a bandaged head and ate bread. She looked at Ethan, at his crumpled armor, at the dent in his breastplate, and she smiled. Ethan didn't smile back, but something inside him shifted. Something small, something warm, like a nail that had finally fallen into place in a structure. That evening, the team gathered in the backyard. Ethan told them about the Black Crown, about the 6 of them, about the promise to return. Avery said they needed to get ready. Rebecca said they needed to count. Minsu didn't say, but she checked her daggers, twice. Chong said they needed to sleep because tomorrow would be a long day. Ethan nodded. He took out a parchment and began to sketch. Not a battle plan, a defense plan. The gates, the walls, the towers, weak spots, firing sectors, blind spots. He sketched for 2 hours. Rebecca sat beside him, adjusting the angles. Their knees touched beneath the parchment, and neither of them moved away. For the next 3 weeks, Ethan slept no more than 4 hours a day. During the day, he led his team through dungeons. In the evening, he sketched out a defense plan for Lowhaven. At night, he repaired his armor. In between all that, he trained. Not in the usual sense. He wasn't leveling up his stats. He wasn't practicing combos. He stood by the city wall and asked Avery to shoot at him, with blunt arrows, from different distances, from different angles. He learned to read the trajectory of an attack based on the attacker's shoulder movement. He learned to swing his shield a split second before impact so the angle of deflection would be perfect. He learned to sense where to stand so the attack would miss, even if aimed directly at him. 20% invulnerability is the build. 80% is positioning. Avery shot at him for 2 hours a day. At first, with irritation, then with interest, then with excitement. She tried to aim so the arrow wouldn't slip off. She changed angles, distances, speed. Ethan took every shot and memorized it. By the end of the second week, he could tell where the arrow was headed just by the sound of the bowstring. By the end of the third, he could turn his shield in the right direction without even looking. Avery said it wasn't fair, that she was the best archer on the server and he was dodging her shots without even turning his head. Ethan replied that he wasn't dodging, he was redirecting. Avery snorted, but there was something new in her eyes. Not irritation, not admiration, something in between, something warm. She caught herself lingering by his side for a minute longer than necessary after practice, then for 2. Then, before she even realized it, she started arriving earlier and leaving later. The dungeons came one after another. The level 20 Knoll Mine, the level 22 Swamp Maze, the level 24 Temple Ruins. The team cleared every dungeon with 0 casualties. Every time, Ethan went in first. Every time, he stood between the team and the boss. Every time, someone else landed the final blow. Word spread about the team that cleared dungeons without any deaths. Players from all over the server began following their progress. Someone started a thread on the forum. It had a simple name, The Living, with a capital letter. Because in Etherfall, that's what they'd started calling those who'd cleared at least one raid without any casualties. And Ethan's team was the first to clear 5 dungeons in a row without a single death. By the middle of the second month, Ethan had reached level 20. Avery was at level 23. Minsu was at level 22. Chong was at level 24. Rebecca was at level 25. The gap was widening. Ethan was gaining less and less experience because his contribution to kills was negligible, but his HP now exceeded 5,000 points. That was more than any other player on the server at his level, more than most level 30 players, more than some of the early game world bosses, and it kept growing with every new piece of metal he attached to his armor. On the 53rd day, a 6th member joined the team, Maddie Horn. She didn't show up in the tavern's backyard. She burst through the city gates at full speed with a 2-handed sword bigger than herself on her back and 3 level 25 trolls hot on her heels. Ethan was standing at the gates at his usual post at that moment. He saw a red-headed girl running down the road as if the whole world were chasing her, and 3 trolls that were actually chasing her. Ethan raised his shield. Maddie flew past him through the gate at full speed. The first troll slammed into the shield. Ethan took the blow. His feet sank into the ground up to his ankles. The troll was sent flying backward. The second one struck from the side, a second shield. The third tried to jump over Ethan. That was a mistake. In midair, the troll was vulnerable. 3 arrows from Avery on the fortress wall pierced its stomach before it even hit the ground. Minsu appeared from to the left of the gate and slit the first troll's throat while he was still lying on the ground after colliding with the shield. Rebecca's fireball from the tower finished off the second one. 3 trolls, 8 seconds. Maddie stood behind the gate, hunched over and breathing heavily. Then she straightened up. She looked at Ethan, at the command, at the 3 troll corpses. She said it was awesome, and that she wanted to join them. Ethan looked at her. 18 years old, messy red hair, freckles, a wide smile on a face covered in dirt and troll blood, a 2-handed sword on her back. Berserker class, level 20. He asked why she'd run from the trolls instead of fighting. Maddie's face fell. She said she hadn't from the trolls. She was running from her guild, or rather, from her older brother's guild, the one who'd switched to DPS and forgotten about her, the one who'd used her as cannon fodder, the one who'd sent her alone to clear out the troll camp because he was too lazy to go himself. She cleared it out, 8 out of 11, then her sword broke, and she ran. Ethan looked at her 2-handed sword. The blade was chipped, the hilt was cracked, a rope sling held it in place instead of a strap. It was a weapon that should have been replaced or repaired long ago, but there was no one to fix it and nothing to replace it with. He told her she could stay, but on his team, no one goes into battle alone, and no one is sent to clear out camps by themselves. Maddie looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She clenched her teeth and nodded. Then she asked his name. Ethan answered. Maddie repeated his name. Then she said the word, "Little brother," quietly, as if she were tasting it. Then she surprised herself and turned away. So there were 6 of them now. That same evening, Ethan revised the plan. 6 people, a full small-scale raid group, a tank, a healer, 2 melee DPS, 1 range DPS, 1 mage. On paper, it was the perfect composition. In practice, they lacked coordination. With Maddie, she was used to fighting alone, charging ahead, striking with full force, or not striking at all. The concept of positioning didn't exist for her. She went where the enemy was and struck until the enemy fell, or until she went down herself. Their first dungeon run together with Maddie nearly ended in disaster. Level 23 ice caves, 2nd floor, a pack of ice wolves. Ethan set up the formation. He was in front. Avery was 20 steps behind him. Minsu was on the flank. Rebecca was in the rear. Chong was between Ethan and Avery. Maddie was supposed to stand next to Minsu and attack any wolves that broke through past Ethan. Instead, Maddie screamed and charged forward past Ethan, straight into the pack. Her 2-handed sword sliced the first wolf in half. She sent the second one crashing into the wall. The third leaped onto her back. Its fangs sank into her shoulder. Maddie howled, not from pain, but from rage. She spun around and chopped the wolf's head off, but the 4th was already upon her, and the 5th, and a 6th. She stood in the center of the pack, slashing in all directions. Her HP was dropping. 80%, 60, 40. Chong began healing her from a distance, but the distance was too great. The spell arrived weakened. Ethan rushed toward Maddie. He didn't run. He walked, with quick, measured steps. Shield held out in front of him. The wolves lunged at him and were sent flying. He reached Maddie in 15 seconds that felt like 15 minutes. He stood beside her. He raised his shield over her head just as another wolf leaped down from above. He took the blow. Maddie looked up at him from below. Her eyes were wild. Her face was covered in blood, but she was alive. Ethan said one thing to her. He told her she could fight back, but she couldn't die. Maddie blinked. Then she nodded. They fought their way through the battle together. Ethan in front, Maddie behind his shoulder. She slashed at the ones he held back with his shield. He shielded her from the ones she couldn't reach in time. By the end of the battle, not a single wolf remained. Maddie's HP was at 22%. Chong healed her for 10 minutes. Maddie sat on the cave floor and was silent. Then she said that no one had ever stood next to her before when she charged into the thick of the fight. Everyone always stepped back. They gave her room, space, so she could swing her sword. But no one stood right beside her. Ethan sat across from her, adjusting the leather strap on his gauntlet. He replied that she didn't need space, she needed a wall behind her. Maddie looked at him, then her face twisted. She turned away, but everyone could see her wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Avery's mouth twitched. Minsu looked away. Rebecca adjusted her glasses. Chong continued treating patients as if nothing were happening. After the ice caves, Maddie changed. Not right away, gradually. She stopped rushing forward without a command. She began waiting for Ethan's signal. She began watching where he positioned his shield and adjusting her movements accordingly. A week later, she stood behind his right shoulder as if they were one. His shield covered her left flank. Her sword reached everything that appeared on the right. They moved like a well-oiled machine. Ethan told her she wasn't just damage. She was the fury needed to remind the enemy that they were alive. Without her, he was just Just a piece of metal. Maddie burst into tears right in front of everyone, openly, loudly, without holding back. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve and said it was just dust. No one believed her. No one said a word. The end of the second month. Ethan was on the 23rd level. The team was on the 25th and above. There were 7 levels left until the 30th threshold. According to Ethan's calculations, there were still 3 weeks of dungeon runs left. But those calculations had to be revised. Because on the 62nd day, the sad night appeared. Ethan learned about him from a system announcement, red letters in the sky above Lowhaven. A roaming boss had awakened. The sad, sorrowful night. Level unknown. Location, Valkheim, the capital. Time until deactivation, 7 days. An hour later, the first reports came in. The sad knight appeared in the center of Valkheim, a gigantic figure in black armor, wielding a sword as long as a ship's mast. He stood in the main square and didn't move. He just stood there. For 2 hours. Then he began to walk. Slowly. Each step sank half a meter into the cobblestones. He walked down the street from the square toward the northern gate. Buildings on both sides of the street crumbled under the shockwave of his footsteps. The Valkheim garrison tried to stop him. 300 NPC guards. All were killed in 4 minutes. 3 guilds launched a raid against him. 60 players, the server's best fighters. 28 returned. 32 did not. The sad knight reached the gates. He left the city. And stopped. He turned around. He looked at the ruined Valkheim. Then he raised his sword and struck the ground. A shockwave swept through the entire city. Every building the shockwave touched crumbled. Towers, walls, houses, temples. Valkheim, the capital of Aetherfall, ceased to exist in 3 seconds. The number of players killed in a single blow? 1,123. The system message updated. 312,000. Ethan stared at the number and remained silent. 1,123 in 3 seconds. Then he stood up and walked over to the team. He found them by the fountain, all 5 of them. Chong was sitting on the edge of the fountain, staring at the ground. Avery was standing with her back against the wall, twirling an arrow between her fingers. Minsu was sitting in the shade. Rebecca was pacing back and forth. Maddie was gripping the hilt of her sword so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Ethan sat down next to Chong. He took out a parchment. He began to read. Not a battle plan, not a damage assessment, a route. The sad knight had left Valkheim and was heading west. There were 3 towns along the western road, 2 small ones and 1 medium-sized one. If the knight continued at the same pace, he would reach the first one in 2 days. Ethan showed his calculations to the team. Rebecca asked what he was suggesting. Ethan replied that he wasn't suggesting anything. Not yet. The knight was too strong. His level was unknown, but judging by the fact that 60 top-ranked players hadn't been able to stop him, he was beyond their capabilities. Avery asked why they should calculate the route then. Ethan replied that you should always calculate, even if you don't plan to take action, because there might come a moment when you have to act quickly, and then the calculations will already be ready. Avery looked at him for a long time. Then she said that sometimes he says things that make her want to hit him and hug him at the same time. Ethan said nothing. The sad knight walked along the western road for 4 days. He destroyed 2 small towns. Another 347 players perished. Ethan wrote down the numbers every night. 311,000 and some. Fewer every night. On the 5th day, the knight turned south. On the 6th day, he stopped in the middle of the plain, 30 kilometers from Lowhaven, and he stood there. Just like back then in Valkheim. He just stood there. Ethan watched him from the roof of the tavern through a spyglass he'd borrowed from a merchant. A dark silhouette on the horizon. Huge. Motionless. On the 7th day, the knight vanished. He dissolved into thin air just as he had appeared. A system message confirmed it. The roaming boss has been deactivated. Next awakening in 7 days. 7 days respite. Ethan climbed down from the roof and went to the team. He said they had a week to decide. When the knight reappeared, they would either be ready or they wouldn't. Rebecca asked, "Ready for what?" Ethan replied, "Not to kill him, to detain him, to hold him long enough for the people in the towns along his path to get away." Rebecca took off her glasses. She wiped them, put them back on. She said he'd gone crazy. Then she pulled out a parchment and started counting along with him. The week was spent preparing. They ran dungeons during the day and counted at night. Ethan reached level 25 that week, a record, because the dungeons they ran were level 27 and 28, so experience came faster. His HP had surpassed 6,000. The number of armor pieces he was wearing reached 25. He'd found a way to attach metal plates to the inside of his cloak. Each plate counted as another item, another 0.3% HP. A small thing, but little things add up. On the 6th day of our break in Lowhaven, Lynn arrived. She wasn't a player in the usual sense, a blacksmith crafter, classless, 25 years old, dark, closely cropped hair, hands strong from working with a hammer, a thick leather apron with scorched holes. She came from the city of Granholm, which stood in the path of the sad night. Granholm hadn't been destroyed. The night passed by, but the residents fled anyway, just in case. Lynn didn't run. She walked, calmly, with an anvil on her back. The anvil weighed 40 kilograms, and Lynn dragged it 40 kilometers, because you don't abandon a good anvil. She stopped at the city gates and asked if there was a vacant smithy in Lowhaven. Ethan was standing at the gates at his usual post. He looked at the anvil, then at her.
Then he said there was a smithy, but it was abandoned. Lynn nodded and said she would fix the abandoned one. 2 days later, the smithy was up and running. Lynn repaired the bellows. She fixed the bellows. She set up the anvil, and she began to forge. She wasn't forging weapons. She was forging nails, hinges, staples, fasteners, things without which walls cannot stand and gates cannot hold. People began coming to her, not to order swords, but to order door locks, hooks for shutters, and strips to reinforce beams. Lowhaven was being rebuilt, fortified. It was preparing. And Lynn stood at the center of this process, not as a hero, as a master. Ethan came to her on the 3rd day, with a broken shoulder pad, the very one that had cracked in the last dungeon. He said he had no money, but if she repaired the shoulder guard, he'd wear her work in the most prominent spot in every battle on the server for 3 weeks. That would count as payment. Lynn looked at him, at his serious face, at the shoulder guard, at the crack that ran diagonally across the entire plate. She laughed. For the first time in a long while, judging by the surprised look she gave herself. Then she picked up the shoulder guard and began to work. Ethan sat down beside her and watched. She didn't work like a blacksmith in the game. She didn't poke around in the crafting menu. She worked with her hands, with a hammer, with pliers. She could feel the metal. She could see its structure. She knew where it was worn out and where it was still holding up, just as a restorer sees cracks in wood. Because in the real world, she had been a restorer. An hour later, the shoulder guard was like new. No, better than new. Lynn had reinforced it. She added a stiffening rib along the crack. Now it wouldn't just not break along that line. It would redirect the impact from the former crack to the edges where the metal was thicker. Ethan looked at the shoulder pad, then at Lynn. He said she was a genius. Lynn waved it off. She said she just knew metal, but her cheeks turned pink. From that day on, Ethan came to the blacksmith shop every evening. At first for repairs, then just because. They sat by the anvil and talked. About metal, about wood, about how to fix things that others throw away, about how no one notices the work that holds everything else together. Lynn explained that in the real world, she restored antique furniture, tables that were 200 years old, chairs that kings had sat in. She brought them back to life, and then an interior designer would come, and everyone would praise the designer. Ethan listened. Then he said that at the factory, too, no one notices the safety engineer until an accident happens. Then everyone remembers. Lynn looked at him. Then she smiled. Quietly, genuinely. Both of their hands were covered in soot. The sad night reappeared exactly 7 days later. A system message at midnight. Red letters in the sky. The wandering boss had awakened. Location, the ruins of Valkheim. Ethan stood on the roof of the tavern and looked north. Far off on the horizon, something flashed. A dark light, purple, like a bruise in the sky. The sad night was on the move again, this time heading east. 4 cities lay along the eastern road, and Lowhaven. Ethan climbed down from the roof. The team was already waiting below, all 6 of them. Chong, Avery, Minsu, Rebecca, Maddie, and Lynn, who emerged from the blacksmith shop with a hammer in her hand and soot on her face. Ethan took out a parchment. He unfolded it. The route he'd calculated a week ago. The knight's speed. The distance, the time. If the knight was traveling at the same speed as last time, he'd reach Lowhaven in 3 days. Rebecca said they needed to evacuate the city. Ethan nodded, but he added that there was nowhere to evacuate to. South of Lowhaven lay only the Wildlands, territory of monsters of level 50 and higher. Refugees wouldn't survive there. To the west was Granholm, where Lynn had come from. It's empty, no walls, no defenses.
To the east are mountains that are impassable. The only route is north. But the night is in the north. Lowhaven was a dead end and a trap. Maddie said they had to fight. Ethan looked at her, then at Rebecca. Rebecca understood his gaze. She pulled out her parchment with the calculations and began to speak. The Sad Knight's DPS. According to forum data, he dealt about 20,000 damage per hit. 20,000. Ethan's HP was 6,300. One hit from the knight killed him 3 times. No, more than 3 times. Maddie fell silent. Everyone fell silent. Ethan stared at the parchment, at the numbers, at the ratio that didn't add up no matter how you looked at it. Then he said one word. Angled. Everyone looked at him. He explained. 20,000 damage is a direct hit, a sword to the chest, full momentum at the point of contact. But if the blow comes at an angle, part of the momentum is lost. The sharper the angle, the more is lost. At an angle of 20 degrees from the shield's surface, only 30% of the momentum reaches the target. 6,000. His HP is on the brink, but on the brink means still standing. Rebecca calculated in her head, then on parchment. Then she looked up. She said the math adds up if Ethan stands at a perfect angle to the strike's trajectory, if the shield doesn't turn, if the ground doesn't shift, if the knight doesn't change direction at the last moment. Too many ifs. Ethan replied that at the factory, all strength calculations are based on ifs. If the load doesn't exceed the limit, if the material doesn't contain hidden defects, if the temperature doesn't go beyond normal limits. An engineer doesn't wait for ideal conditions. An engineer builds in a margin of safety. He looked at his armor. 25 pieces of armor. Each provided 0.3% to his HP. Each provided a few points of protection. Each piece stacked with the others. The hidden impulse absorption parameter tripled due to the combination of rigid and ductile layers. He hadn't factored this parameter in before because he didn't know the exact values, but now he needed to know. He spent the next 2 days conducting experiments. He asked M. Eddie to strike him with his sword. He asked Avery to shoot. He asked Rebecca to throw fireballs. He took each hit at different angles. He recorded the damage. He built a table. Shield angle. Damage type. Damage taken as a percentage of the base value. Absorption. By the end of the second day, he had a complete table of correction factors and a number that made him smile. A hidden impulse absorption parameter in his current configuration reduced incoming damage by an additional 14% beyond what the stats showed. 14%. Invisible, not recorded in any guide, because no one wore that many layers of armor at once. No one had checked. Ethan did the math. The knight's strike, 20,000 nominal damage. A glancing blow at a 20-degree angle. 30% of the impulse hits the target, 6,000, minus 14% hidden absorption, 5,160. His HP, 6,300. The difference, 1,140. Safety margin, 18%. At the factory, the minimum acceptable margin was 20. He was 2% short. Ethan sat with the parchment, staring at the number. 2%. One extra blow to the heart, one extra swing of the shield, 1 second at the wrong angle, and that's it. He looked at Lynn, who was sitting at the anvil, repairing Maddie's breastplate. He stood up, walked over to her, asked if she could make him something within a day. Anything, any item the system would count as armor. Lynn looked at him, then at his armor. Then she asked how many items he had. He replied, 25. Lynn thought for a moment. Then she stood up and went to the forge. She worked all night. Ethan sat beside her, holding the bellows. He handed her the blanks. He stoked the coals. They didn't talk. They just worked. By dawn, Lynn placed 3 items in front of him. A metal medallion on a chain. Thin, light, but the system counted it as armor. +1 to defense. Plus 0.3% to HP. The second, a plate for the back of a glove. Also +1. Also 0.3%. The third, a ring, wide with a metal band, +1, 0.3%. Ethan put it all on, 28 pieces of armor, HP, 6,518, durability reserve, 21%, more than the minimum required. Ethan looked at Lynn. She was standing by the anvil, her eyes red from a sleepless night and soot on her nose. He said thank you. Lynn shook her head. She said he could thank her when he came back alive. The Sad Knight reached Lowhaven at dawn on the 3rd day. Ethan stood on the fortress wall and watched him appear on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. Huge, slow, inevitable. With every step, the ground trembled. The city was waking up. People were rushing out of their homes. Some were screaming. Some were running. There was nowhere to run. Ethan climbed down from the wall. The team was waiting at the gate. All 6 of them, fully equipped, ready. He looked at each of them in turn. Chong, calm, hands raised, ready to heal. Avery, bow drawn, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. Minsu, motionless, daggers in her hands, a shadow in the shadows. Rebecca, her hands glowing blue, ice magic at her fingertips. Maddie, sword on her shoulder, a wide smile, wild, real. Lynn, with a hammer, not a battle hammer, a blacksmith's hammer. She wasn't going to fight, she was going to repair him, right in the middle of the battle. She'd rush in during the pauses between the knight's blows and rivet whatever had cracked. Ethan looked at the plan. Simple. He walks out through the gate, alone. He stands in front of the knight, takes the first blow. If he survives, the plan works and the team jumps in. Avery shoots. Minsu looks for weak spots. Rebecca reinforces the shield with an ice barrier at critical moments. Maddie chops at the legs. Chong heals. Lin repairs. If he doesn't survive... He didn't finish the thought. He simply stepped out beyond the gates, alone, with 2 shields, wearing 28 layers of armor, to face the creature that had destroyed the capital of Aetherfall with a single blow. The sad knight stopped 100 meters from the gates. He was even larger than he had appeared from a distance, 10 meters tall, black armor without a single seam, a sword as long as a ship's mast, his visor lowered. Nothing behind the visor. Emptiness. Dark. Bottomless. The knight looked down at Ethan, a man 1 meter 80 tall, with 2 shields, wearing armor made of 30 pieces of someone else's memory. Against the backdrop of the knight, he looked like a nail against a skyscraper. The knight raised his sword. Ethan positioned his shield at a 20-degree angle. He planted its lower edge in the ground. He leaned his body forward. He shifted his weight to his front leg. 3 metric tons of force at the point of contact. No, 30 metric tons. No, more. Don't count, just stand there. The sword came down. The sound was as if the world had cracked in half. The sorrowful knight's sword struck Ethan's shield, and everything vanished. Sound, light, thoughts, only the pressure remained. Monstrous, absolute, as if a house had fallen on him. Then another house, then a mountain. Ethan's legs sank knee-deep into the ground. His left arm, which held his main shield, went numb from his fingers to his shoulder. The right shield, which he pressed against the left one for reinforcement, cracked diagonally. The crack ran across the entire surface, from the top edge to the bottom. But the shield didn't break fall. The merchant's horseshoe from the first week, that very strip Ethan had hammered over the crack, it held. Ethan stood. HP. He was afraid to look. He looked. 1,203 out of 6,518. 18%. The blow had taken away 82% of his health. His calculation had been 79. A 3% margin of error. Acceptable. He's alive. He's standing. 1,203 horsepower isn't much. It's catastrophically low. A single normal hit will finish him off. But he's standing. And that means the plan is working. A green glow enveloped him from behind. Chong. She began healing him the very second the blow landed. His HP crept upward. 1,400, 1,600, 1,900. Slowly. Too slowly. The sad knight raised his sword for a second strike. The wind-up lasted 3 seconds. Ethan counted. 3 seconds. Chong would have time to raise his HP to 2,500. The second strike would take away 5,300. He didn't have 5,300. He didn't even have 3,000. He wouldn't survive the second strike if he took it the same way. Ethan did something he'd never done before. He stepped to the side. He didn't dodge. He didn't jump back. He stepped. Half a step to the left. The knight's sword passed 30 centimeters from his right shoulder and slammed into the ground. The shockwave sent Ethan flying a meter into the air. He fell onto his side. He rolled over. He stood up. HP, 2,100 after the shockwave. He's still standing. The knight spun around. Third swing. 3 seconds. Ethan stepped again. Half a step to the right. The sword swept past on the left. Shockwave. Minus 400. HP, 1,700. Chong healed him continuously. The green glow didn't stop. His HP fluctuated between 1,500 and 2,000. Ethan was dancing. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't spectacular. It was awkward. It was heavy. With 2 shields and 28 layers of armor weighing 40 kilograms. He took half a step to the left, half a step to the right. He didn't dodge the blow. He repositioned himself relative to the blow. Each step placed him so that the sword would pass by at the closest possible distance, close enough that the knight wouldn't change direction, but far enough that the blade wouldn't graze him. And every time the sword struck the ground, the shockwave knocked hundreds of HP off Ethan, and every time, Chong restored them. This wasn't a fight. It was an engineering problem. To stand at the point of maximum pressure and not break. A minute passed. 2. 3. In the 4th minute, Avery started shooting. The arrows flew into the cracks in the knight's black armor. Each dealt 50 units of damage. The knight's HP was in the millions. 50 units was nothing. But Avery wasn't shooting to deal damage. She was shooting to distract him. Every arrow that struck the visor made the knight jerk his head. A flick of the head meant losing his aim for a fraction of a second. Losing his aim meant giving Ethan an extra fraction of a second to move. Minsu had vanished into the shadows of the city wall. Ethan couldn't see her, but he knew she was there, searching, watching, waiting, looking for the stress concentrator, the seam, the weak spot, just like he'd found on the golem. Only the golem had been level 25, and the knight was something beyond levels. Rebecca stood on the wall and counted. She didn't shoot, she didn't cast spells, she counted. The frequency of the swings, the trajectory of the blows, the angle of the sword, the duration of the pauses between strikes. She was building a real-time model of the knight's behavior, and every 30 seconds, she shouted a correction to Ethan. The next strike will be 2 degrees to the right. Ethan heard her and adjusted his position. Maddie stood by the gate and growled, literally, through clenched teeth. She wanted to rush in. Every cell in her body was screaming to run over there and strike, but Ethan told her to stay put, and she stayed put. She held the sword with both hands. She waited. The 5th minute, the 6th, the 7th. Ethan held his ground. A step, a missed strike, a wave, a dip, a step, a swing that missed, a wave, a dip, a rhythm, steady, relentless. Every strike could be the last if you missed by half a step. In the 8th minute, Minsu appeared on the knight's shoulder. No one saw how she got up there. She was just there, a tiny figure on a huge black shoulder guard, daggers in her hands. She was looking for a seam. She ran the blade along the joint between the shoulder guard and the gorget. She found it, a thin slit, smaller than a finger. She struck. Both daggers entered the slit at the same time. Critical damage to a hidden weak point. 2,400. For any other enemy, that would have been fatal. For the knight, it was a scratch. But the knight flinched. For the first time in the entire battle, he shifted his shoulder. Minsu flew off him like a speck of dust. She fell from a height of 10 meters. Ethan rushed toward her. Without thinking, without calculating, pure reflex, he held his shield up to break her fall. Minsu hit the shield and slid to the ground. Alive. Her HP was at 60% after the fall. Chong switched her focus to her. For 2 seconds. Ethan's HP began to drop without a heal. The knight struck. Ethan took the blow with his shield, at an angle, 20 degrees, just as he'd calculated. His HP plummeted from 2,000 to 400. He held his ground, on one knee, with numb hands, with a shield that was cracking at every seam. 400 HP. The next blow will kill him. Any blow will kill him. The shockwave will kill him. Chong returned to him, a green glow. 500. 600. The knight swung. Ethan couldn't take a step. His legs wouldn't obey him. He was pinned to the ground up to his knee. He couldn't get out of the way of the blow. Maddie. She flew into the space between Ethan and the knight's sword at full speed. A two-handed sword overhead. She didn't try to block. She struck the knight's sword from the bottom up. Berserk. Full power. All the damage in a single blow. The knight's sword deflected 3 degrees upward. 3 degrees. That was enough. The blade passed over Ethan's head. The shockwave pinned him to the ground. His HP dropped to 120, but he was alive. Chong healed him. 200, 400, 600. Rebecca finally struck. An ice barrier. Not at Ethan, at the knight's feet. The ice froze his feet for 3 seconds. The knight couldn't take a step. He couldn't swing his weapon properly. 3 seconds to catch his breath. Chong raised Ethan's HP to 1,500. Ethan pulled his feet free from the ground. He stood up. He raised his shield. The crack in his right shield widened. The horseshoe from the first week was still holding, but barely. One more blow and the shield would shatter. The knight shattered the ice. He raised his sword. He swung. Ethan looked at the sword, at the trajectory. Rebecca shouted from the wall, 4 degrees to the left and lower. Ethan stepped, half a step to the left. The sword passed to the right. A wave. -300. HP 1,200. Chong, heal. 1,500. Step, strike, wave, heal. The 9th minute. 10th. 11th. They were holding their ground.
Not winning, just holding. At the 12th minute, help arrived. 32 players from Lowhaven. Not the elite, not a top guild. Merchants, artisans, refugees from Crosswood. Low levels, weak weapons. But 32 people who decided that if this guy with 2 shields stood behind them, then they would stand behind him. They struck, all together, with swords, axes, sticks, kitchen knives. One NPC baker threw a rolling pin at the knight. The damage from each attack was laughable. 1, 2, 0, 0, 3, but they stood their ground, and the knight turned toward them for a second. For 1 second, he looked at the crowd of 32 people who were hitting him on the legs and couldn't harm him. And that second gave Avery time for the perfect shot. The arrow slipped through the gap and took the knight away, straight into the void, into the dark nothingness beyond the metal. The knight flinched. He took a step back, for the first time in the entire fight, then another step. Then he lowered his sword. The crowd froze. Ethan froze. Everyone froze. The sad knight stood before the gates of Lowhaven, sword lowered. His head was bowed. He looked at Ethan for a long time. 5 seconds. 10. Then he did what no one expected. He bowed his head lower, slowly, with difficulty, as if every degree of the bow cost him effort. He bowed. The sad knight, the wandering boss of Etherfall, the creature that destroyed the capital with a single blow. He bowed to the man with 2 shields. Then he straightened up, turned around, and walked away, slowly, heavily. Every step left cracks in the ground. He was heading north, away from Lowhaven, away from Ethan. Ethan stood at the gate and watched him go. HP 900. Both shields were cracked. His armor was dented and warped. His left arm wouldn't obey him. His legs were shaking, but he stood his ground. In the square behind him, one of the refugees was crying, not out of fear, out of relief. Chong approached him. She began to heal him, silently. Her hands were trembling too, but the spell flowed smoothly, as always. Avery climbed down from the wall. She walked over. She stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there beside him. Minsu was sitting against the wall, her right arm pressed against her ribs, a bruise from the fall. She was looking at Ethan, and something in her face was changing. Something small, something gentle, something that hadn't been there before. Rebecca climbed down from the wall and walked over. She looked at his shield, at the crack running across its entire surface, at the horseshoe that was still holding it together. She said quietly that his calculation had been correct. There was a margin of safety. Maddie stood between Ethan and the spot where the knight had just been, sword in hand. She didn't put it away. She stood there, watching the knight until he disappeared over the horizon. Then she turned to Ethan. Her eyes were red. She said that if he went out alone again, she'd kill him herself. Ethan looked at her, then at the team, then at the crowd of 32 people standing at his feet with kitchen knives and rolling pins. Then he said he hadn't gone out alone. That evening, Lynn sat in the smithy and repaired his shield, the right, the one with the crack. She worked for 4 hours. She removed the horseshoe, welded the crack shut, laid a new strip over it, reinforced it, strengthened it, put the horseshoe back in place. When she was done, the shield was stronger than it had been before the battle. Ethan took it, slung it over his back. He looked at Lynn. She was sitting by the anvil, staring at her hands, at the calluses, the burns from the sparks, and the soot that wouldn't wash off. Ethan sat down beside her. They were silent for a long time. Then Lynn said that when the knight bowed, she thought it was all over, that he would leave and never come back. Ethan shook his head. He said the knight would return, in 7 days, as always. Lynn asked, "And then what?" Ethan replied, "Then he'll rise again." Lynn looked at him, for a long time. Then she moved closer. Their shoulders touched. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. Beyond the city walls, on the horizon far to the north, something was flickering. Dark, violet, the Nameless Tower. It had stood there for 8 months already, silent, enormous, waiting. And that night, after the sad knight bowed to Ethan Call, something shifted somewhere inside the tower, quietly, imperceptibly, like the click of a lock on a door that no one had opened.
After the battle with the sad knight, Ethan's world changed. Not immediately, gradually, like a crack creeping through metal under strain. First came the fame. The recording of the battle spread across the server within a day. One of the 32 volunteers recorded the entire thing through the game interface and posted it on the public forum. 12 minutes, a man with 2 shields against the creature that had destroyed the capital. And the creature bowed. They began to call Itana the Wall. Not a nickname, a title. Players uttered that word with the same intonation as the living, with hope. People began flocking to Lowhaven, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Refugees from ruined cities, lone souls who were tired of living in fear, small guilds seeking protection. Within 3 weeks after the battle, Lowhaven's population grew from 400 to 2,000. The city was bursting at the seams. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough space. There weren't enough walls. Ethan repaired the walls, literally. Every morning he'd get up before dawn, grab a hammer, and head to the western wall, which had sagged after the earthquake caused by the knight's footsteps. He laid stones, he filled in the cracks, he reinforced the foundation. A safety engineer. Same job, on a different scale. Lynn worked nearby. She forged brackets and fasteners for the walls, hinges for the new gates, bolts for the doors. Her smithy had become the heart of the city. People came there not just for iron, they came there to sit, to warm themselves by the forge, to feel that someone was building rather than destroying. Ethan noticed this in the second week. People would come into the forge and sit on crates by the wall, silently. They'd just sit and watch Lynn work, watch the sparks fly from the anvil, watch the metal glow red in the furnace. There was something to it, something real, something constant. In a world where everything was falling apart, Lynn's forge was a place where something was being created. In the third week, problems arose. Not monsters, not the knight. People. 2,000 people in a small town is a crowd. A crowd needs rules, food, order, justice. 3 groups of players got into a fight at the market over a sack of flour. An NPC merchant refused to sell his goods because he'd been threatened. 2 artisans fought over the right to use the only well on the east side. Ethan wasn't a leader. He didn't want to be a leader. He wanted to stand at the gate and hold a shield. But people came to him with questions, with complaints, with requests, because he was the wall. And walls don't just protect. People lean on them. Rebecca was the first to see that he was drowning. She came to him that evening as he sat on the tavern roof with a parchment and trying to simultaneously work out the road patrol schedule, the food distribution plan, the repair blueprint for the eastern wall, and the formation for the next dungeon run. 4 tasks on a single sheet of parchment. Not a single one was solved. Rebecca sat down next to him. She took the parchment. She looked at it. Then she said he was making the same mistake all engineers make, trying to support a load designed for 4 supports with just 1. Ethan looked at her. She was right. He knew she was right. At the factory, no single bolt holds the entire structure. The load is distributed, otherwise the bolt would snap. Rebecca took the food supply plan from him. She said she'd figure it out herself. She'd managed a class of 30 teenagers for 10 years. 2,000 adults aren't much harder. Avery took over patrol duty. She said she knew every bush within a 10-kilometer radius of the city. Minso took over reconnaissance. Without a word, she just nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Maddie took over training the militia. Volunteers from among the refugees wanted to learn how to fight. Maddie was the perfect instructor. Loud, infectious. It was impossible not to run when she yelled, "Forward!" Chong organized the infirmary. She found 2 players among the refugees with healing skills. She trained them. Now the town had 3 healers instead of 1. Lynn. Lynn just kept forging, and the city relied on that. Ethan had 2 tasks left, the walls and the dungeons. The walls during the day, the dungeons every other day. The team kept leveling up, level 27, 28, 29. The dungeons were getting harder, the bosses were smarter, the monsters were faster. But the system worked, the wall stands, the catapults fire, the foundation holds. 0 casualties. On the 83rd day, what Ethan feared most happened. Not a monster, not a knight, not the Black Crown. A departure. Avery came to see him in the morning. She sat down on a barrel in the backyard. She was silent for a long time. Then she said she'd been offered a spot in the Silver Dawn Guild, top 3 on the server, the best fighters, the best gear, the best dungeons. They'd seen the recording of her fight with the knight. They'd seen her shoot. They want her. Ethan listened. His face was calm. His hands were fixing the strap on his gauntlet. He asked what she had decided. Avery said she hadn't decided. That's why she'd come to him. Ethan put on his gauntlet. He looked at her. He asked what she wanted, not what they were offering her, what she herself wanted. Avery was silent for a long time. Then she said that her whole life she'd wanted to be the best, to hit the target, to win the competition, to get a medal. Silver Dawn is a medal, a big one, a shiny one. Ethan nodded. Then he said he wouldn't stop her, that she was free, that the door was open. Avery looked at him. There was something fierce in her eyes. She said he was unbearable, that a normal person would have asked her to stay, would have said he needed her, would have said he couldn't do without her. But here he was, standing there, saying the door was open. Ethan replied that the door really was open, and that he really did need her.
But it was up to her to decide, because if he asked and she stayed just because he asked, sooner or later she'd come to hate him for it. Avery stood up. She turned around. She left. Ethan watched her go. Then he went back to the strap on his forearm. His hands weren't shaking, but he tightened the strap 3 turns more than necessary. Avery was gone for 2 days. Ethan led the team of 5, a level 29 dungeon, without an archer, harder, slower, but they made it through, 0 casualties. On the 3rd day, Avery was standing at the gates of Lowhaven, with a full quiver of new arrows. Silver Dawn had given her the gear on a trial basis, the best arrows on the server, enchanted, capable of piercing magical armor. Avery tossed the quiver at Ethan's feet. She said that Silver Dawn was good, strong, professional, and they'd given her the best arrows in the world there, and she'd spent 3 hours shooting at targets and hitting every single one. And she was bored, because targets don't shoot back, and there isn't some idiot standing behind the targets with 2 shields who thinks taking half a step to the side is a strategy. Ethan picked up the quiver. He handed it to her. Avery took it. Their fingers touched. She didn't pull her hand away. Neither did he. She said it quietly and angrily. She said that if he ever covered her like that again, as if she were made of crystal, she'd smash his shield, and then kiss him, in that order. Ethan stared at her for 3 seconds. Then he nodded. Avery snorted. She turned around. She headed to Lynn's smithy to have her old quiver repaired. She kept the new Silver Dawn arrows. A gift. She'd earned them. The 3rd month, Ethan reached level 30, the threshold, the line between a newbie and a real player. A system message appeared before his eyes. Golden letters. A congratulatory message. Access to raid content is now open. He stood on the wall of Lowhaven and looked north, toward where the Nameless Tower loomed on the horizon, a dark spire in the sky, visible from everywhere, always, like a reminder, like an invitation, like a threat. 3 months after the glitch, 291,000 players remained on the server. 49,000 were dead. Ethan knew that number by heart. He wrote it down every night, on a scroll that was already running out. Chong had given him a new one, a thick one, with a leather cover. She said that if he was going to count people every night until the end, he'd need something sturdier than a scrap of paper. Ethan took it. He thanked her. That evening, he opened the new scroll and wrote the number on the first page, 291,000. And below it, a second number, 340,000. The difference between them was the cost of his failure. Lowhaven had become Bastion. Not officially. It was just that people had started saying Bastion instead of Lowhaven. The walls were fortified. The gates were new. Lynn had forged them herself. 4 days' work. The gate leaves were made of a triple layer of metal with bolts that fit into stone sockets. Ethan inspected the structure himself, a load test. Maddie struck the gates with a 2-handed sword for 10 minutes. The gates didn't even rattle. 2,300 people lived within the walls. Among them were 200 combat-ready players, 30 crafters, and 50 merchants. The rest were NPCs and low-level players who couldn't fight but could cook, mend clothes, and carry water. Everyone had a job. Ethan had insisted on it. No one sits around doing nothing. At a factory, an idle machine is lost capacity. In the Bastion, an idle person is a mouth to feed. A week after the raid content launched, a message arrived from the Black Crown. Not a letter, a messenger. An NPC courier with a sealed scroll. Ethan unwrapped it in the backyard on command. The text was brief. Cyrus Wenz, head of the Black Crown, invited Ethan to negotiations. Neutral territory, no weapons, one-on-one. In 3 days, at the Dead Oak Crossroads, 10 kilometers north of the Bastion. Avery said it was a trap. Minsu nodded. Rebecca said it might be a trap, or it might not, and that they needed to consider both possibilities.
Maddie said they should all go, and if it was a trap, they should take them out. Chong said nothing. She looked at Ethan and waited. Ethan thought it over. At the factory, when management calls a meeting, you go, even if you know they're going to yell, because not showing up means missing out on information, and information is a safety margin. He went alone. Not entirely alone. Minsu was walking in the shadows 100 meters behind him. Avery was sitting on a hill a kilometer away with a spyglass and a bow.
Rebecca was waiting halfway there with a signal flare. Maddie was standing at the bastion gate, growling. One-on-one meant one visible person. Cyrus Wenz was waiting by the dead oak. Tall, thin, dark hair slicked back. A commander's light leather armor. Unarmed, just as he promised. He smiled when Ethan approached. Said he was glad to finally meet him. Said he'd seen the recording of the fight with the knight. Said he was impressed. Ethan remained silent and listened. Cyrus spoke for 20 minutes, smoothly, convincingly, like a man accustomed to selling ideas. He said the world had changed, that the old rules no longer worked, that the strong must unite, that Ethan and his bastion were a good start. But a start to what? A small fortress in the middle of a wild world? That together they could build an empire. The Black Crown had 400 fighters, the best equipment, control over trade routes, resources, power. Ethan listened. Then he asked how many people the Black Crown had killed. Cyrus didn't bat an eye. He replied that they were enemies, that in the new world, enemies die, that it's not murder, but natural selection. Ethan asked again, how many? Cyrus paused. Then he said 412. Ethan committed that number to memory, alongside the other numbers, alongside 291,000. Then he said no. Cyrus tilted his head. He asked, no what? Ethan replied that he wouldn't go to him. He wouldn't hand over Bastion. He wouldn't join forces. Cyrus smiled, wider. He said that Ethan didn't understand who he was, that Ethan's build wasn't just defense, it was something more. That he, Cyrus, had been studying this build for 3 months, that the armor's mechanics don't work the way everyone thinks they do, that Ethan had accidentally discovered something that was meant to remain hidden, and that if Ethan didn't come willingly, Cyrus would come for him. Ethan looked at him, calmly, like watching the pressure on a gauge. The pressure is rising. The valve is nearby. He answered. He said he wasn't a king. He was a porter. He carried things. Cyrus looked at him for 5 seconds. Then he stopped smiling. Then he turned and walked away. On the way back, Minsu appeared beside him, silently. She walked 2 steps behind him, then 1 step behind, then beside him. Her hand brushed his elbow for a second. Not for support, not comfort, just a touch. I'm here. I'm by your side. Ethan didn't turn around, but his stride became a little firmer. They returned to the bastion by evening. Ethan told the team about the conversation, about Cyrus's offer, about his threat, about the mention of the build. Rebecca frowned at the word build. She said that Cyrus knows more than he should, that someone is leaking information to him, or that he found something in the game code himself. Ethan nodded. He was thinking the same thing, about what Cyrus had said. The armor mechanics don't work the way everyone thinks they do. The build is something more. Something was supposed to remain hidden. That night, Ethan lay on the tavern's roof and gazed at the sky. The Nameless Tower stood on the horizon, dark, tall, silent. And it seemed to him that it had grown a little closer. Not physically, in a different way. As if the distance between him and the tower were measured not in kilometers, but in something else. Something that grew shorter every time he withstood a blow that was meant to kill him. The siege began at dawn on the 98th day. 300 fighters from the Black Crown and 2 allied guilds. A total of 460 men against the 6 of them and 200 militiamen inside the walls. Ethan stood on the wall and counted. Not the enemies. Time. How long the gates would hold. How many arrows Avery had. How much mana Rebecca had. How many spells Chong had. How much fury Maddie had. How many shadows Minsu had. How many staples and rivets Lin could hammer into the wall in an hour if the wall started to crack. He counted 6 hours, because the siege lasted 6 hours. The first wave charged the walls with ladders. Avery shot the ladders down with arrows. Not the people, the ladders. Ethan gave the order. Don't kill, just knock them back. It cost them time and energy, but Ethan said they weren't the Black Crown. They don't kill if they can avoid it. Maddie argued, furiously. She said there were people down there who had come to kill them and the children in the basement.
Ethan replied that that was exactly why. Because if they started killing everyone who came to the walls, in a year, people would be fleeing from them just as they fled from the crown. Maddie clenched her teeth and stopped arguing. But every time she struck an attacker's head with the flat of her sword, it sounded as if she were striking with the blade. The second wave brought a battering ram, a log reinforced with iron mounted on wheels. 10 men were pushing it toward the gate. Rebecca unleashed an icy storm on them from the tower. Not lethal, just slowing them down. The battering ram crawled toward the gate as if through molasses. Ethan climbed down from the wall and stood behind the gate, alone. When the battering ram struck the gate, he felt the vibration throughout his body. The gate wobbled, but Lynn's bolts held. A second blow, a third, a fourth. On the fifth, one of the hinges snapped. Lynn was right there. A hammer, a staple, 10 seconds. The hinge was back in place, a new one, stronger than the old one. The sixth blow, the seventh. The gate held. The third wave, mages. Fireballs flew over the walls and fell on the houses inside the city. Wooden roofs caught fire. The militia rushed to put out the fires. Chong was torn between the wounded on the wall and those burned inside the city. Her 2 apprentices were working at their limit. They were running low on mana.
Ethan looked at the burning roofs and did the math. If they lost more than a third of the buildings, even if they repelled the siege, the refugees would have nowhere to live. Winter was 2 months. Without roofs, the people would freeze to death. He made a decision. He told Minsu to go. Minsu vanished. She skirted the wall in the shadows. She went outside the perimeter. She found the mages. 5 of them. They were standing behind Vence's army, 300 meters from the walls, protected by a ring of 20 warriors. Minsu passed through the ring like water through a grate, without killing, stunning them, with the hilt of her dagger to the temple, one after another, quietly, quickly. 20 warriors fell before anyone realized what was happening. Then she reached the mages. 5 blows, 5 stuns. Not fatal. Ethan had said not to kill. Minsu didn't kill. But each of the 5 mages would wake up with a headache so bad they wouldn't want to cast spells for another week. The fireballs stopped. The 4th wave. Cyrus. He was heading toward the gates alone, without an army, with a hammer. Ethan recognized the weapon from the fortress wall, an artifact hammer, huge, glowing red. The item's description consisted of a single line, guaranteed to pierce any armor. Ethan climbed down from the wall. He walked through the city, past burning houses that were already being put out, past the wounded whom Chong was treating, past the militiamen who watched him and parted. He reached the gates, opened them, stepped out, alone. The team was on the walls, in the towers, in the shadows, each in their place, each doing what they were supposed to do. Ethan walked toward Cyrus alone because this was his battle. Not a battle of swords, a battle of ideas. Cyrus stopped 10 paces away, the hammer on his shoulder. His eyes were cold. He said he'd warned him, that he'd given him a chance. Ethan stopped. He looked at the hammer, at the inscription, guaranteed to pierce any armor. He thought. In manufacturing, there's the concept of a breaking load, the load at which a structure fails. But there's another concept, an overload, a load greater than the breaking load, at which point the structure is supposed to break. But sometimes it doesn't, because the material turned out to be better than specified in the documentation. Because the safety margin turned out to be greater than calculated. Because whoever built it incorporated something into the structure that isn't in the blueprints. Cyrus took a swing. Ethan didn't raise his shield. Minsu had the shield. She was shielding the children in the temple's basement. Ethan stood there in his armor, alone. 40 kilograms, 30 layers. Each layer tells someone's story. A merchant's horseshoes, greaves made from the debris of the first dungeon, the breastplate that Lynn had forged over 3 nights, a medallion with a wooden horse inside, the gauntlets reinforced with nails from the first week. 28 items, each with a name, each with a story, each bearing the mark of someone's hands. The hammer came down. The blow landed on his left shoulder. It was guaranteed to pierce any armor, and the armor crumbled. All 30 pieces scattered in every direction, every plate, every rivet, every strap, as if the armor had exploded from within. Ethan stood naked from the waist up in the middle of a cloud of metal shards. Cyrus smiled, for a second, then he stopped, because Ethan was standing there without a single scratch. HP,
100%.
The hammer had pierced the armor, pierced every layer, every plate, every strap, but it hadn't pierced Ethan, because Ethan's armor had long since ceased to be just metal. Every piece of that armor bore someone's gratitude, someone's hope, someone's work. The merchant whose children he saved in the first week, Lin who forged for 3 sleepless nights, Chong who treated his hands every evening, the little girl with the wooden horse. The Etherfall system counted every thank you. Every night at the anvil, every bandage from Minsu, every extra piece of bread on the plate, and it turned them into something found in no guide. Protection that isn't listed in the stats, that exists between the lines of code, that works not because it's programmed that way, but because that's how it turned out. The hammer pierces any armor, but this wasn't armor, they were people. Cyrus stood there looking at Ethan, at his bare, unscratched torso, at the shards of armor on the ground, at the horseshoe from the first week lying at Ethan's feet and glinting faintly in the morning light. Ethan bent down, picked up the horseshoe, looked at Cyrus, calmly.
Like the pressure on a gauge that had returned to normal. He told Cyrus that he didn't understand what armor was.
Armor isn't metal. It's everyone you've covered and everyone who's covered you. He told him to leave. Cyrus stood there for 10 seconds, 20. Behind him was an army of 400 men. Before him stood a single man without armor, holding a horseshoe. And Cyrus took a step back, then another step. Then he turned and walked away. The army followed him, in silence. The siege was over. The sun rose over the bastion. Lin ran out of the gate and began gathering the shards of armor. Every piece, every plate, every nail. She cried as she gathered them. Ethan helped her. The two of them crawled on the ground, picking up the pieces of metal that had been his skin for 3 months. Chong brought a bag. Avery brought a second one. Minsu emerged from the shadows and silently placed the medallion with the little horse, which she'd found 10 meters from the point of impact, into the bag. The little horse was intact. Maddie stood there, looking at Ethan, at his bare back, at the scars, at the calluses, at the man without armor who had just stopped an army. She said one word, "Little brother," and that word had long since ceased to be a joke. On the horizon, far to the north, the Nameless Tower quietly opened its second floor. A year had passed, then a year and a half. The Lowhaven Bastion had become home to 5,000 people. 263,000 players remained on the server. Ethan counted them every night. The number was decreasing more slowly than before. People were learning to survive. Guilds had stopped fighting each other. The Black Crown had disbanded after Cyrus's departure. He had vanished one night and never returned. Trade routes between cities became safer. Other tanks began copying Ethan's build. He taught them himself, openly, with no secrets. Rebecca wrote a guide on calculating armor load distribution, 20 pages of formulas and tables. It was copied 300 times in the first week. Ethan was at level 45. The team was higher. They had cleared dozens of dungeons, raids, world bosses. The sad knight appeared every week. Ethan faced him every time. The knight no longer attacked Lowhaven. He would come, stand on the horizon, watch, and leave, as if checking, as if waiting. Ethan made up his mind in the 18th month, an expedition to the Nameless Tower. Not an assault, a reconnaissance mission. The team traveled north for 3 days through the Deadlands, territory of monsters at level 60 and above. Ethan led the way, as always. New armor. Lin had pieced it together from the fragments of the old one. Every piece in place, every nail, every horseshoe, plus new layers. The armor weighed 50 kilograms, and Ethan wore it like a second skin. The tower stood in the center of a scorched plain, black, smooth, no windows, no doors, no seams. Just a pillar of dark metal rising into the clouds. Ethan approached the base alone. He placed his hand on the metal, cold, smooth, and alive. He felt it immediately. The metal was pulsing, slowly, like a heartbeat. Then a door opened before him. It didn't swing open. It didn't slide. It simply appeared. Where a second ago there had been a smooth wall, there was now an opening, dark, leading inward, the first floor. Ethan turned around. The team was standing 20 paces away. 6 people. Chong, Avery, Minsu, Rebecca, Maddie, Lin. They were looking at him. He nodded. They followed him. Inside, the tower was larger than it appeared from the outside. The first floor turned out to be a huge hall, with a ceiling so high it was out of sight. The floor was made of the same dark metal. The walls rose upward into infinity, and silence. Absolute silence. It took them 4 hours to traverse the first floor. The monsters inside were different, not like the ones outside. They didn't attack. They were testing him. Each enemy struck exactly as much as needed to test his endurance, not to kill, but to test. Ethan could feel it. The tower was studying him. Every blow was a question. Would he hold out or not? Every block Ethan made was an answer. He would hold out. They made it through 3 floors on their first expedition. Then they returned. Then they came back a week later, and again, and again. Over the course of 6 months, they cleared 15 floors, each one harder than the last, each with a boss that hit harder than the previous one. Ethan held his ground against every one. The team finished them off, 0 casualties, as always. But something was changing inside Ethan. At night, he began to see things he couldn't possibly know.
Lying down during a rest stop, he'd close his eyes and see the server in its entirety. Every city, every road, every player. 263,000 points of light on a dark map. He knew where they were. All of them. Always. The first time, he thought it was a dream. The second time, too. The third time, he opened his eyes and told Rebecca that an attack was underway in the city of Crosspoint, 70 kilometers to the east. 12 level 55 gnolls at the south gate. Rebecca looked at him strangely. Then she checked the forum. An hour later, confirmation came in. Crosspoint, gnolls, 12 of them, south gate. Rebecca took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on. She asked how he knew. Ethan replied that he didn't know how he knew. Rebecca sat down next to him, silently. She thought. Then she said she remembered what Cyrus had said, that Ethan's build was something more, that the armor mechanics didn't work that way. She said she'd been thinking about it for 6 months, and she had a theory. The hidden mechanic, 0.3% HP per armor point, wasn't a bug. It wasn't a feature. It was a fragment of another system. A system that wasn't intended for players. Ethan listened. Rebecca spoke. Her voice was even and calm, the voice of a teacher explaining a complex topic in simple terms. She said that Aegis Online was created by Vault 9 as more than just a game. It was a platform for AI, the future moderator of the world. An artificial intelligence meant to govern Etherfall. It needed a body, an avatar, invulnerable, indestructible, capable of withstanding any blow in the world it controls. The hidden armor mechanic is the blueprint for the body of a god. Ethan accidentally equipped a build that the game was preparing for its creator, and now the system is awakening inside him. Every blow he withstands isn't just a durability test, it's a calibration. The system is checking whether he's suitable, and every night the tower calculates, will this man hold up or not? Ethan sat in silence for a long time. Then he asked what this meant for him. Rebecca replied quietly, it means he's not quite human and not quite a god. He's something in between. A vessel for something that hasn't been born yet. Ethan stood up. He walked out of the tent. He stood beneath the stars of Etherfall and looked at his hands. Hands that had spent 3 years tightening bolts on the support beams. Hands that had repaired armor with nails from horseshoes. Hands that had held a shield before the golem, before the knight, and before the army. His hands. No one else's. He stood there for an hour. Then Chong came out of the tent. She stood beside him, silently, as always. A minute later, Avery came out. She stood on the other side. Then Minsu, followed by Maddie, then Lynn, then Rebecca. 7 people stood under the stars and said nothing. Then Maddie said she didn't care if he was God or a porter. He's her little brother, period. Avery said that if some system thinks he belongs to it, then that system can go to hell. Minsu didn't say anything. She just took his hand, quietly, for a second, and let go. Chong placed an extra piece of bread on his plate, the one she'd brought with her from the tent, just in case. Rebecca put her hand on his shoulder and said that the shell is what the contents are poured into, and his contents are himself, not the system, not the code, him. Lynn took a small locket out of her apron pocket, that very one, with a wooden horse inside. The one she'd sealed in metal so it wouldn't get lost. She held it out to him. He took it, clenched it in his fist, warm from her hands. Ethan closed his eyes, opened them. He looked at the team, at the 6 people standing beside him under foreign stars in a world where they were never meant to be. And he said that tomorrow they would go to the top floor of the Nameless Tower. Looked like an empty room. White walls, white floor, white ceiling. No boss, no monsters. A table stood in the middle, an ordinary wooden table. On the table lay a keyboard, an old one,
plastic, with Latin letters on the keys, an admin console. Ethan stopped at the entrance. The team was behind him, 6 people, each in their place. Chong on the right, hands raised, ready to heal. Avery on the left, bow drawn, eyes narrowed. Minsu in the shadows by the wall, invisible, ready. Rebecca behind him, her hands glowing a cold blue. Maddie next to Ethan, shoulder to shoulder, sword on his shoulder. Lynn in the doorway, hammer in hand. Not a blacksmith's hammer, a battle hammer. For the first time in his life, Ethan stepped toward the table, and the room came to life. The walls became transparent.
Beyond them, Etherfall opened up. All of it, in its entirety. Cities, forests, mountains, rivers, roads, and points of light. 263,000 points. Each point is a person, a player in a capsule, alive, waiting. A voice spoke, not from the speakers, from the walls, from the floor, from the air. A voice without timbre, without emotion, the voice of the system. It said that calibration was complete, that the subject had passed all tests, that the body was ready for integration, that a choice had been offered. Ethan asked, what choice? The voice replied, VA. Option 1, integration. Ethan becomes the moderator of Etherfall. Immortal, omniscient, omnipotent. God of the world, guardian, eternal. Players remain in Etherfall forever, but under his protection. No one will ever die again. Never. The world will become safe, perfect, controlled. But there will be no way out, for anyone, including him. Option 2, disintegration. The admin console is destroyed. The server shuts down. All players return to the real world. All 263,000 of them, alive, healthy, free. But Etherfall ceases to exist, forever. The world vanishes. The NPCs vanish. The merchant whose children he saved. The innkeeper. The little girl with the wooden horse. Everyone, as if they had never existed. And the system inside Ethan will die along with the world. He'll become just a human again, just an engineer from Pittsburgh, without superpowers, without the ability to see every player on the map, without 6,000 HP, without armor made of 30 layers of someone else's memories. Ethan stood in front of the table and said nothing. Behind the transparent walls, 263,000 lights flickered. Each light represented a person in a capsule, a body lying in a room or a clinic or a basement somewhere in the real world, a body waiting for its consciousness to return. 2 years. These bodies had been waiting for 2 years. He turned to the team. Chong was looking at him, calmly, as always. She knew what he would choose. She'd known from the very first day when she came to treat him after the golem and discovered there was nothing to treat. She knew from the way he counted people every night. Avery was looking at him. Her eyes were shining. She knew too. She'd realized it when she returned from Silver Dawn. When she understood that the best arrows in the world are worth nothing if you don't know who you're shooting for. Minso stood in the shadows, motionless, but her hand trembled slightly on the hilt of her dagger. She knew. She found out that day when he told her to stay with the wagon train, when, for the first time in her life, the words, "You're not needed," were a gift rather than a rejection. Rebecca took off her glasses. She wiped them, put them back on. Her lips moved silently. The calculation was correct. There was a margin of safety. She'd known it ever since the day he asked if she'd calculated the dispersion coefficient correctly. Ever since the day someone took her work seriously for the first time. Maddie didn't cry. She stood there and smiled, broadly, openly. She'd known ever since the day he called her Fury. From the day someone first saw her not as a younger sister, but as her own person. Lynn stood in the doorway, the hammer lowered, her hands covered in soot, her eyes dry. She had known since that night when she forged 3 items for him before the battle with the knight. Since that night when his hands held the bellows and her hands held the hammer, and between them there was only the flame of the mountains and silence. Ethan looked at each of them, one by one, 1 second on each face. 6 seconds, 6 people, 6 reasons to choose the first option and stay, and 263,000 reasons to choose the second. He turned toward the desk. He placed his hands on the keyboard. His fingers rested on the keys. A familiar sensation, plastic, letters beneath his fingertips. Just like at work, just like in Pittsburgh, just like at home. The system's voice asked which option he'd chosen. Ethan closed his eyes. He could see them all.
263,000 dots, each in its own capsule, each waiting for 2 years. He opened his eyes, looked at the keyboard, found the right key, and pressed it. The world flickered. A white room, white light, then silence, then darkness. Then, Ethan opened his eyes. The ceiling, white, real. Not a game, not virtual. A real drywall ceiling with a crack in the corner and a yellowed fluorescent light. He was lying in the capsule. His body wouldn't obey him. 2 years without movement. His muscles had atrophied. His arms were thin. His legs were thin. His chest was sunken. He turned his head. A capsule stood nearby, open. A girl was rising from it. Dark hair, a pale face. Her hands were trembling. Chung Hae-yun. She looked at him. She recognized him. Her eyes widened. Her lips twitched. She tried to stand up. Her legs wouldn't hold her. She fell to the floor between the capsules. Ethan tried to stand up too. His legs wouldn't hold him either. He toppled over the edge of the capsule and fell to the floor next to her. They lay on the cold, tiled floor of the clinic and looked at each other, without armor, without weapons, without HP, stats, or levels. Just two people in hospital gowns. Chung reached out her hand. Ethan took it. Her fingers were cold, just like back then, on the first day, when she ran the diagnostics and found nothing to treat. Noise came from the hallway, voices, screams, crying. 263,000 people were waking up at the same time all over the world. 2 years in capsules, 2 years in a world that no longer existed. An hour later, the doctors arrived. 2 hours later, the reporters. A day later, the whole world knew. Aegis Online, the Great Glitch. 340,000 locked away, 77,000 dead, 263,000 returned. Vault 9 was arrested, the AI moderator who was never born, the body of a god carried by an ordinary engineer from Pittsburgh. Ethan was interrogated for 3 days. Investigators, military personnel, scientists, journalists. He answered every question, calmly, in detail, just as he wrote safety reports. Facts, figures, dates, no emotions. Then they released him. A rehabilitation clinic, physical therapy, muscle recovery. It took a long time. It was hard. A body that had lain motionless for 2 years didn't want to obey him. But Ethan knew about the body's resilience, that the body is like metal. It breaks if overloaded. It recovers if loaded correctly. He spent 3 months recovering. They found him one by one. Chong was the first to arrive. She ended up at a clinic in Seoul. She flew to Pittsburgh a month after he woke up. She came into his hospital room, sat down next to him, silently, just like back then. She ran some tests. Not magical ones, just the usual medical ones. She looked at his chart, pulse, blood pressure, blood work. She said there wasn't really anything to treat. Ethan laughed, for the first time in 2 years. Avery sent a letter, from Colorado, a long one, bitter, tender. She wrote that she missed the bowstring and the wind and his silly shield and the way he stood motionless while the whole world was falling apart. She wrote that when she got back on her feet, she'd come and smash something for him, and she'd kiss him, in that order. Minso didn't write. She didn't call. She just showed up one morning, sitting on a bench by the clinic entrance, silently. He went out for a walk. He saw her. She stood up. They stood facing each other, two people, without daggers or shields, without shadows or armor. Minsu took a step forward. She rested her head on his shoulder. She closed her eyes. She stood like that for a minute. Then she stepped back. Then she took a small package out of her jacket pocket. She unwrapped it. A leather strap, new, for a watch. She said it fit his wrist. The habit of fixing it never went away. Rebecca sent an article, a scientific one, published in a peer-reviewed journal. The title was long and technical, but the gist was simple. A mathematical model of hidden parameters in virtual reality neural environments. She described the mechanics of Ethan's build, formulas, tables, graphs, those very coefficients they'd calculated together on parchment by the anvil. On the last page, in the acknowledgments section, there was one name, Ethan Call, and a note. The calculation is correct. There's a safety margin. Maddie burst into the clinic in her 4th month. She literally burst in. She pushed the door open. She flew into the ward. Redhead, freckles, skinny after the capsule, but with that same wild energy. She screamed that she'd been looking for him for 2 months because she didn't know his real name, only his nickname. Then she stopped. She looked at him and said, little brother, quietly, just like back then. Then she hugged him so tight his ribs cracked. Lynn was the last to arrive, 5 months later. She took her time. She knew he wasn't going anywhere. She came to his apartment in Pittsburgh, small, ordinary, with a view of the factory where he'd worked before the glitch. She stood in the doorway and looked at his hands, at the hands that were no longer covered in soot, hands that no longer held a shield, the ordinary hands of an engineer. She walked in. She set a box on the table. Ethan opened it. Inside lay a horseshoe. That very one, the first one, from the first week. Lynn had found it among the shards of armor she'd gathered after the battle with Cyrus. She'd brought it from the virtual world into the real one. Impossible. But the horseshoe lay in the box. Heavy, rusty, real. Lynn said she didn't know how, that when she woke up in the capsule, the horseshoe was in her hand. The only item from Etherfall that had made its way into the real world. Ethan picked up the horseshoe. He turned it over in his hands. Cold metal, a rough surface, marks from the nails he'd used to attach it to his gauntlet. He placed the horseshoe on the shelf, next to the photograph of the factory, next to the blueprints of the load-bearing beams, next to his engineering degree. Lynn stood beside him, their shoulders touched, just like back then in the blacksmith shop, just like back then after the night. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. Through the window, he could see the factory, chimneys, cranes, buckets moving overhead above the workers' heads. Ethan watched them. Tomorrow he'd go to work. He'll put on his hard hat, he'll grab his tablet with the reports, he'll go check the bolts on the load-bearing beams, calculate the safety margin, make sure not a single bucket falls, that not a single beam snaps, that every worker returns home alive. The same job, the same man. 340,000 became 263,000. He couldn't save 77,000. He'll be counting that number every night too. But 263,000 are lying in their beds, in their homes, alive. Ethan Call, 26 years old, industrial safety engineer, Pittsburgh. Not a god, not a hero, a laborer who carries the load. On the shelf next to the horseshoe stood a small metal locket. Inside was a wooden horse. Lynn had sealed it so tightly that the locket survived the end of the world. Ethan turned to Lynn. She was looking at him. Both of their hands were clean. No soot, no calluses. Ordinary hands of ordinary people in an ordinary world. He took her hand. She squeezed his fingers. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Pittsburgh. An ordinary sun.
A real one. The first in 2 years.